Thank you, everybody. A joint public hearing with the Planning Board and the City Council was held in the Council Chamber on Thursday, December 13th, 2018 at 6:30 p.m. for the purpose of discussing an ordinance to amend an ordinance relative to zoning by adding a municipal and religious adaptive reuse overlay district to facilitate the appropriate reuse of eligible buildings and thereby protect and advance the general public welfare within Section 8.0 Special District Regulations by adding Section 8.7 Municipal and Religious Reuse Overlay District. This ordinance amendment includes Sections 8.7.1 through 8.7.11, outlining respectively purpose, location, eligibility, dimensional requirements, uses allowed by special permit, site plan review, historical commission and design review board review, affordability, parking and loading, conflict and severability. The ordinance amendment provides a tool to allow for reuse of eligible buildings that will best serve the community but will minimize impacts to surrounding neighborhoods while also facilitating historic preservation, economic development, housing production, and environmental sustainability and resilience. Notice this meeting was posted on November 21st, 2018 at 3:53 p.m. and advertised in the Salem News on November 29th, 2018 and December 6th, 2018. Absent are Councilors Flynn and Council President Gerard. At the request of our Dean of the City Council, Tom Fury, I, Ward 5 Councilor Josh Terrell, presiding. Thank you. I would like to call upon the Chair of our Planning Board to introduce our members, Ben Anderson.
Ben here, I'll let the board members introduce themselves.
Thank you.
Noah Forrest.
Kurt Reeder. Bill Brissette.
Do we have more trapped outside the room?
Matt's running a little late. He's expected to be here.
All right.
Is that a quorum?
So if we, with Matt not here, we'll start as soon as we have the fifth member arrive. And what I will do is I'll just recess briefly until that time, since we do need the quorum. So. Without further ado, everybody just relax for a few minutes and I will put this back into session as soon as we have it.
Stuck in traffic. Open up an entire room.
Just very quickly, you don't have to all go running back to the seats, but we are one member of the planning board short. So Matt Vino is on his way over here right now from my side of town, should be here in about 10 to 15 minutes at the most, and then we will get this underway. A couple of other members who did not expect to have to be here tonight have been notified as well. So basically whoever walks in the door first, we know if somebody gets here before that, we'll get started. But until then, we are going to remain in recess. All right, I will take this from the top now that we have one of our two maps. City of Salem, December 13, 2018, joint public hearing of the City Council and Planning Board. A joint public hearing with the Planning Board and the City Council was held in the Council Chamber on Thursday, December 13, 2018 at 6:30 p.m. for the purpose of discussing an ordinance to amend an ordinance relative to zoning by adding a municipal and religious adaptive reuse overlay district to facilitate the appropriate reuse of eligible buildings and thereby protect and advance the general public welfare within Section 8.0 Special District Regulations by adding Section 8.7 Municipal and Religious Reuse Overlay District. This ordinance amendment includes Sections 8.7.1 through 8.7.11, outlining respectively purpose, location, eligibility, dimensional requirements, uses allowed by special permit, site plan review, historical commission and design review board review, affordability, parking and loading, conflict and severability. The ordinance amendment provides a tool to allow for reuse of eligible buildings that will best serve the community, but will minimize impacts to surrounding neighborhoods while also facilitating historic preservation, economic development, housing production, and environmental sustainability and resilience. Notice this meeting was posted on November 21st, 2018 at 3:53 p.m. and advertised in the Salem News on November 29th, 2018 and December 6th, 2018. Since the last time I tried this, Councilor Flynn is now here, so currently only absent is Council President Gerard. Normally, the task of leading this meeting would fall to the senior counselor, which would be Counselor Fury. He, however, asked me to do this in his stead. So I remember starting the last time I was behind this podium on a regular basis. I remember a room that was just about as full as this. So Counselor Turiel presiding. I will introduce the members of the planning board, because why make them go through it again? We have Chairman Ben Anderson, we have Matt Smith, Bill Grissett, Kurt Reeder, and Noah Koretz. So also we have from the city, we have the mayor and members of the planning department who will go through the proposed ordinance and take questions from the council and the planning board. Just to kind of reacquaint people with the format here, this will begin with us having the mayor and/or her designees up here to discuss the proposed ordinance, take questions from the city council, take questions from the planning board. After we have done that and gone through all members' questions, I will then be opening up discussion to the public. We will go around the room. When you come up, we ask you, there's a form to sign up on over on the podium over there. We ask that even if you signed on one of the other forms, that you still sign on that if you haven't already, because the city clerk is looking for that to make sure that she has a definitive record of all the people who've spoken. So that's pretty much how it worked. What we ask is that I'm not going to go around the room in support and in opposition. I think given the crowd here, that's impractical. What we'll do is simply go around, at that point, state your name and address for our records still, just to make sure we have it. If you can keep your points brief and on topic, and then also if you have something else if you have something to bring to it, if somebody else has already kind of said your piece for you, please acknowledge accordingly, because there's a lot of people, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to want to speak, so we want to try and get through everybody and do so expeditiously. So with that, I would first ask the mayor to come up.
Thank you, Councilor Turiel, and members of the public who are here. Apologies for starting late. I want to point out that we anticipated having 5 different members here, and Matt Smith actually kind of bailed us out and got off a work conference call early to get here. So something happened with another member who was anticipated coming that couldn't be here. I think it might be appropriate for me to read just the cover letter that accompanied the ordinance that was into the council as a frame. Then I'm going to ask Amanda Chiancola, a member of the staff, to go through sort of the technical details of the proposed ordinance. And then we just want to answer we did receive some emails with a few issues that I want to call out, and happy to answer questions on any of them. So this message is actually from Tom Daniel, who was out this week, and that's why he's not able to attend this hearing, but did spend yeoman's effort and time putting this ordinance together. On June 14th, the City Council passed an order that the Planning and Community Development Department develop a zoning overlay district to facilitate the reuse of the Archdiocese's schools and other properties. The goal of the ordinance is to allow for reuse of eligible properties while facilitating historic preservation, economic development, housing production, and environmental sustainability and resilience. The approach to the ordinance is consistent with the council order, the 2015 Historic Preservation Plan update, values expressed through Imagine Salem and other plans and studies. The proposed overlay applies to lots and buildings that have been in a municipal or religious use at some point within the past 20 years, and that have been in such uses for at least 20 continuous years. An eligible lot must contain a building that is at least 3,000 square feet and must be at least 50 years old. Lastly, there must be a change in use to one or more of the uses identified in the overlay. Because it is an overlay, an applicant may elect to either develop a project in accordance with the requirements of the underlying zoning district or in accordance with the requirements of the overlay. Most of the properties that I think most people would look to are actually in residential districts, R1 or R2, and it's really not practical to redevelop them in an R1 or R2 standard. They're just too large. Those are my words, not the letter. The overlay requires a special permit from the planning board and site plan review. The overlay expands the role of the Historic Commission by requiring written comment for properties outside of local historic districts. The overlay also requires new detached construction to have written comments from the Design Review Board. 10% of the housing must also be affordable within the contents of the ordinance. Since the June council order, staff in the department have been working to develop the ordinance. We held a public meeting on July 9th to review an initial draft. We revised the draft considerably and limited the scope to only municipal and religious uses. We reviewed the revised proposal at a second public meeting on October 3rd, 2018. In response to comments received at the October meeting, we've made further revisions to the ordinance as follows. 4 parks met the eligibility requirements because of the buildings on them. The city obviously has no plans to develop them, and the overlay now explicitly excludes parks. Community members expressed concern about the height of steeples being referenced as the maximum building height allowed. The overlay now includes language that clarifies that the height does not include steeples. A suggestion was made to include a minimum distance from existing commercial uses to special permit commercial uses. While we feel the appropriateness of commercial uses is already included in the planning board's required findings, the overlay now includes a specific finding that the public good will be served and the commercial use would not adversely affect any underlying residential district. In reviewing the eligibility criteria across the entire city, we found that 27 properties would be included in the overlay as of this date. The letter submitted to the council includes the 27 properties. Of the 27 properties, only 4 are currently vacant. And those 4 that are vacant are the old senior center on Broad Street, the what we're calling the Immaculate Conception School, some know as the St. Mary's School, the former Boys and Girls Club on Hawthorne Boulevard, the St. Anne's School and Convent at 9 Cleveland Street, and I'm using vacant in that capacity a little lightly because I know there is some use that does happen in that building, Boy Scout meetings, things like that, but largely vacant. And then St. James School, located at 150 Federal Street. Of the entire city, there are 27 properties, only 4 are vacant. You will see on the list that you have, schools, City Hall, clearly properties that we have no intention of vacating or not using, but they do meet the standard eligibility requirements. We're looking forward to reviewing this particular proposal with the council, and I want to stress the key opportunity that this ordinance provides to address some of the housing demand in our community. I think one of the key resources using existing buildings, historic properties, many of which are vacant, and allowing them to be reused adaptively and preserved would provide an opportunity for us to meet a very significant housing demand that currently exists in our community. I'm going to ask Amanda Ciancola to come up and just go through some of the technical details that are outlined in the ordinance, and then I definitely want to point out some of the issues that have been raised so we have a chance to talk about those.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mayor. Amanda Ciancola with the Planning Department. So as the Mayor mentioned, what we know today are there are 4 vacant buildings, partially vacant with St. Anne's, and there's not a clear permitting path for any of these buildings. This ordinance provides clarity in the permitting path. An important consideration that went into the ordinance is that it's not spot zoning and that it's not going to benefit a single property owner. And so with that in mind, it includes all municipal and religious properties that meet a certain criteria. And again, that criteria is that it was a municipal or religious use for at least 20 years and at some point in the past 20 years. The building has to be at least 50 years old, at least 3,000 square feet. And again, there has to be a change in use for that to be eligible. And again, I want to note the ordinance is an overlay. And so a developer can choose to use this overlay, or they could use the underlying zoning. For properties that are located in the B5 or the downtown zoning, they would be unlikely to use this ordinance because it's not as flexible as B5 zoning. It is not as of right. It requires a special permit with objective criteria from the planning board. And that includes looking at neighborhood character and traffic flow. It also requires site plan review. So that means all the site plan review criteria outlined in section 9.4 applies. And that's including but not limited to adequacy of parking, circulation of all modes of transportation, vehicles and pedestrians, landscaping and drainage. And I'd also like to note that on larger scale projects, the planning board typically requires a peer review to look at drainage, utilities, traffic, and parking. And then a minimum of 10% of the units must be deed restricted as affordable. So again, the purpose of the ordinance is to preserve the historic assets, promote sustainability, provide more homes, particularly affordable homes, while also being mindful that the context of these buildings are they're challenging to repurpose. Sometimes the repurposing cost can be could be more expensive than new construction. Systems such as electrical wiring, heating, fire protection, those could be out of code. There could be lead paint and asbestos, and often the interior isn't efficient for residents. And so those are challenges that the developer will have to overcome in developing these properties. So a key fact we learned from best practices is that you have to have flexible zoning to make this financially feasible. We modeled the zoning ordinance off of our existing processes. So the granting authority of the special permit is the planning board, like they are for a planned unit development or an NRCC special permit. It also requires review from the historical commission. This actually expands the role of the historical commission beyond the local historic districts. Again, we recommend the B5 dimensional standards, and that's to provide flexibility. The ordinance allows for a limited amount of new construction. Again, that's to provide the developer some flexibility. The total lot coverage is 50%, and that includes the existing structure and any new construction. The new construction will require review from the design review board, and this expands the design review board's oversight beyond the entrance corridors in the North River Canal. And while an adaptive reuse project may have some level of new construction, it always begins with the adaptive reuse of the existing building. That's the role of this ordinance, is to repurpose that structure. We believe that this draft ordinance is responsive to the council order that the council put in back in May, in that it provides a permitting path to ensure these historic properties are put into productive use. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. I'm going to turn it back over to the mayor to wrap up.
All right, thank you, Amanda.
Just wanted to touch base before we go into questions and answers to identify some of the concerns that we've heard from folks relative to the ordinance as a means to try and address them up front. So one of the concerns we heard was related to the new construction component that Amanda just talked about. The ordinance allows, I think, up to 50% of the lot to be covered with a building. So there are some lots, very few I want to point out. I think we identified only 10 of the private property lots that actually would meet any minimum qualifications for allowing any additional construction on their site. Remember, you have to meet your parking and your access and circulation needs and all the site plan needs before you're really going to be able to allow to do any additionals or additional building on a lot. I'll give the senior center as an example. That particular building is about 25% of the lot, so there is space available on that lot to allow for an additional building. However, you could never meet your parking or your access and circulation by putting any additional space on that, any additional building on that lot. So that will not happen. I want to call out the flexibility and why the new addition, not why the new construction. So very few of the properties would even meet the qualifications, as we mentioned, of the new construction. But these properties are so challenging. The reason we left that in is to provide that flexibility on the handful or so where it might work. The key to that is recognizing that even some of the historic preservation properties that have recently been, or adaptive properties that have been recently adapted, required some new construction. I'll point to the Salem jail as an example of that. That jail project, and many of you were involved in that project, almost never got done. It almost did not get done. Even to this day, it's a little bit of a miracle that it did. Super hard to redevelop. The only way it was possible was by the addition of the housing that they added in the back to make all those numbers work. They maximized every single available historic tax credit and subsidy they could. They have no percentage of affordable housing in there. It couldn't support any additional affordable housing in that particular development. And I share that example just to stress how hard it is. There are parameters around the new construction. It's not something that we're looking to maximize. The goal of this ordinance is historic preservation of the buildings that exist. Sometimes it may be required to add some additional capacity in order for that to occur, given the cost and complexities involved in rehabbing these properties. We've also heard about some concerns that the Design Review Board and the Historic Commission, while they're giving input, it's not an approval process. With DRB, I'll speak to that one first. Every single DRB component we have is input. And I will say the Planning Board, I think, really welcomes that input. They work in partnership with the Design Review Board to get that input. And then you have one body that comprehensively is looking at site plan review. It's important that we have somebody kind of quarterbacking that process. And let me take a minute to commend the Planning Board for the work they do. If you look at this group before you, there's professionals here that we couldn't afford to hire reviewing projects on a volunteer basis, on a regular basis, to help improve our city. So we really feel like it's important that that feedback go back to that body who's permitting the overall project and then get incorporated into the project as necessary. That's how it works in all the DRB requirements, all of the SRA Urban Renewal District, all of the NRCC. It's a recommendation, it goes back to the Planning Board. With respect to the Historic Commission, any property in a historic district is going to go before the Historic Commission, just as anybody who owns a home or a property does now. So that review will be intact. Properties outside of the historic district, however, will be given input. So just like the DRB, give us your recommendations, review this, bring it back to the planning board so it can be incorporated and have one body and a holistic approach. I also want to point out anybody using historic tax credits, and I'm going to hazard to guess just about all of these projects, at least the ones that seem to be the most imminent, and those are the Archdiocese projects, are going to need historic tax credits to get done. They're big buildings and have lots of need, and there's no way just a redevelopment alone without these subsidies is going to happen. If you use historic district or historic tax credits, those come from the state or the federal government, there's a higher standard for historic compliance. So you're already going to be at like a 106 review standard process, which means the preservation is going to be key, and you're going to have a lot of eyes looking at the property from historic preservation perspective. So we feel like the addition of an approval adds process time, and you don't have that complementary holistic approach coming from the planning board who's managing the site redevelopment. We've heard some concerns that there's not enough affordable housing, that 10% is too low. And I think that's a clear reflection of how many people are hurting here. I mean, I said this earlier this morning for those of us who were at the chamber breakfast. I think affordable housing is the biggest challenge we have in our community. It is a threat to the character of Salem. For 400 years, people from different backgrounds, different income levels living here. And as housing prices have increased and rents have skyrocketed, it is much more increasingly difficult for the people who have been living in Salem for a long period of time to stay. And housing is a critical component. We'd love to have a higher number of affordability in this. We would welcome this. 2 of the properties that we're talking about are currently under site control with the North Shore Community Development Corporation, the CDC. Their mission is affordable housing. If there's any way to increase the affordable component in here, I think they're absolutely geared up to do that. And some of that's around financing and cost to manage that. But to have a threshold that's higher than 10%, knowing how challenging these projects are, seems to me to be something that would disincentivize the reuse of these properties and make them even harder to be preserved. So that's not something that we're willing to put forward or incorporate. 10%, I do want to stress, is a minimum, not a maximum. And so that's something that we don't even have in some of the historic properties that have been adapted. We've heard some concerns about parking requirements. The parking requirements are the same that we currently have in the B5 in the NRCC. The council just adopted those. It's consistent with that. The planning board does have oversight over that. If they felt like they needed more parking, they certainly could add to that, but it's consistent with what we've been seeing as a practice. And our goal eventually is to be able to not need a car when you live in Salem, and a lot of these developments are finding across, frankly, not only Massachusetts, but the country. The more parking you provide, the more cars there are, and sometimes by reducing that, you actually change behavior. So we feel the parking's adequate. Why not zone individually? Like, why are we doing this, right? Why do we have an overlay in 27 properties? Wouldn't it be easier just to take them one at a time? Just deal with the Archdiocese properties. Well, there really isn't a good way to do that. You would have to go in individually and I think spot zone. We've never found another path to how these properties who sit in neighborhoods, because they were servicing neighborhoods as churches and schools, and now are going to take on a different need. They're in an R1 or R2 district that's primarily R1 or R2. So what you would have to change them to would be out of character with the rest of this, the particular neighborhood. In other buildings that were reused, we've got several old schools on Flint Street in North Salem that have been redeveloped. At that time, the city allowed use variances, and developers came in and sought a use variance to change from the former school to housing. They're all primarily housing. We don't allow use variances. I would not recommend a use variance as a thing that we want to do, because I do think that opens the door to a lot more trouble than it's worth. This overlay is designed to stick to the properties that would qualify, the historic properties that were formerly churches and municipal uses, most of which are still churches and municipal uses. They're not necessarily changing anytime soon. But if there were to be changes, there's a mechanism and a path that involves permitting in a thoughtful way. We've heard from people who said this will incentivize the closure of churches. We don't think that's going to happen. There have been churches that have closed with nothing to do with this ordinance. Churches that are closing are not because they're incentivized by reusing their buildings. It has more to do with what's happening within their congregation. I think the last thing I'd want to say is we got some feedback. I received an email today relative to this ordinance actually flying contrary to the work that we're doing in our community in other areas. I think there was even a Jane Jacobs editorial, that there's Jane Jacobs' famous New York Times editorial taking Salem and our community to task for urban renewal. The urban renewal plan at the time was to demolish all of the buildings, right? Knock them all down and put new buildings in their place. Thankfully, that didn't happen, right? We've preserved these buildings, they're adaptively reused, it's been to our benefit. This ordinance is designed to do that. This is an ordinance that's going to allow these buildings that exist. We have infrastructure that's here, buildings that aren't really living up to their capacity, either by providing an active use, housing, or some other purpose, but primarily housing, paying us any taxes. And the longer they lay vacant and fallow and underutilized, the harder they are to be redeveloped. So, zoning is an imperfect science to a certain extent. We're trying to create and cultivate an opportunity for these buildings to be reused adaptively, relying on the strength of our planning board with a process that provides flexibility, but doesn't harm it in a way that disincentivizes reuse to occur. We've been pretty good at this in the past by allowing historic adaptive reuse here, but I think if we don't advance this, we're not going to have a process in place that will allow these properties to be redeveloped. I want to really stress that. There is no path forward for permitting unless we look at this particular ordinance as an overlay. The spot zoning argument would be one that people would win on if we tried something else. So I hope the council understands what's at stake in terms of the opportunity to repurpose these sites, create some additional housing, and we'll look at this ordinance as a tool to do that. I'm not going to tell you it's 100% perfect, but I think it is very, very good and will help us achieve the goals that we ultimately have, I think, collectively as a community. Thank you.
So if I can open up the questions, I'll ask the mayor first on this, or Amanda, if it's whoever's applicable. I myself, having gone through this, am generally supportive of it. I have a couple of concerns, and I'm sure my colleagues and my colleagues and members of the planning board will have their own issues to question you on. But my question is on the parking requirements. I have the one parking space for existing and 1.5 for new. I don't see any issue there. I am somewhat concerned with the municipal parking facility option, because the only place that really applies to likely at this point is Hawthorne Boulevard, but that's a fairly stressed area from a parking perspective, and the municipal garages right next to it are already fairly highly loaded with pass parking. So that would be a concern that I'd have going into it. I'm sure some of my colleagues will probably want to speak to it too. On the new construction side, I am glad that the steeple is expressly excluded. The question that I have, I understand what you're saying about the site coverage there and some of that. I would like to see that spelled out a little bit more precisely, because I do have some concerns to that. And then the last thing I would question on is, in terms of the property selection, is there a reason why we didn't put the old St. Joe's on there? Because I know that site has been partially reused, but there is still a rectory and a old school building that's part of it, and those have been lying just as fallow as some of the other buildings, and we would love to see those revitalized.
Do you want to speak to parking in St. Joe's?
For St. Joe's, we just went through all the buildings that were at least 50 years old, 3,000 square feet in the assessor's database, and that did not pop up. But again, this list is not part of the ordinance. It's just properties that we found based on the assessor's database that met the criteria. So if that property is eligible because it meets the criteria, then it'd be eligible. I'm not sure which criteria it didn't fit under. And in terms of parking, we can look into the municipal garages.
So I want to just call out two things on the parking as well. I've spoken with the CDC about their proposals. Obviously, the Hawthorne Boulevard site, it's tight. It doesn't come with a lot. There's limited parking around it. I think they are trying to identify uses for both properties that take into consideration some of the challenges around parking and what is happening in the surrounding neighborhoods. With respect to St. James, I think they're eyeing senior housing. It's close to the community life center. They'd love to be able to sort of bootstrap off what's happening there and create a community on that site.
Parking on that site is quite adequate.
And parking on that site is adequate. On the Hawthorne Boulevard side, I think they would love artist residence. There's a big auditorium in that space. Hard to repurpose auditoriums into housing. The thinking is, could you create more of an artist community there that could utilize that space in a different way? The struggle with that site is the size and the lack of availability of parking. So how to repurpose it and make sure that it's not further impacting the neighborhood, I think, is a key challenge. Wouldn't have an answer for you, Councilor. It was a school, it was a Boys and Girls Club, it was an active site that had people coming to and from it. I don't know how we struggle with, or I guess I don't know how we address the challenge that we want that site repurposed, regardless if there's a parking lot that comes attached to the building. There may be some opportunities to do some shared parking on site with the church and look at what's on street as well to help accommodate some of the growth there. But it's tricky there for sure. Did we miss one of your concerns?
That's the dimensionality that you spoke to that some.
Did you have clarifications on the 50% lot coverage? Is there?
Well, I get that from how you stated things. It did not. That was not the limiting factor of that was not something that seemed clear to me in my reading of it. So, and granted, I am not a planner, so my expertise is not there. But
happy to answer any questions. Other questions?
Other
St.
members of the
Joseph's?
council?
Did you follow up with St. Joseph's Church?
Yep.
Did she answer the question?
Yes. Questions from members of the council? For the Councilor Dominguez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is regarding the minimum that you say 10% for affordable housing. That's the minimum.
That's the minimum.
Yeah, there is no way to negotiate that into a bigger percentage based on the need that we had in Salem. And a second question on that is that include low-income affordable housing, including to that package.
Correct.
And the last question is three questions in one. Is do you think that having the minimum on those properties that we are redeveloping will alleviate the situation? Can you give some numbers based on what we had and what we need?
Yeah. So the 10% minimum is based on what we currently do, more by permitting conditions. We don't have an inclusionary ordinance. We are right now, work is underway on an inclusionary ordinance with the Affordable Housing Trust Fund Board, members of the staff, and working with MAPC to really calculate out what's the cost of development, what's the maximum affordable housing that we could expect to incorporate into new construction here, new projects that are being developed, so we can maximize that number. We would love that number to be higher. I can share with you that Cambridge, one of the cities that has some of the fastest rising housing prices, which can be helpful as well in terms of trying to maximize affordable housing, they've only maximized theirs to 20% with significant density bonuses. So I think we want to maximize the affordable housing, but not create such a burden that it becomes a barrier to getting these sites developed. That's why we left it at 10%. Do I think inclusionary housing ordinances or a 10% requirement alone is going to address our affordable housing needs? Absolutely not. We are going to need to be more aggressive in terms of how we look at building new affordable housing. We have not built new affordable housing in the city since the Salem Housing Authority days when they were getting grants from federal and state partners. Those grants aren't readily available, but I think we're going to have to look at how would we subsidize it, whether it's public property the housing authority owns or other public entities that might be available for reuse to try and drive down the cost of housing. It's the cost of the land, the cost of the construction that contributes to what it costs to put these properties up, and then a desire, obviously, from a developer to make a return on investment. If we can attack one of those areas, we might be able to drive down some of these costs and create some additional affordable housing. Many of you know I'm on the Housing Authority Board. There are thousands of people on the wait list for subsidized affordable housing. We also have a huge need for workforce housing. These are folks who pour your beer, pour your coffee, work in the service industry, and you could work in the service industry and afford an apartment in Salem. That is no longer the case. We've seen two-bedroom rental increases over 55% in the last year alone. If you haven't searched for an apartment lately, go on Craigslist. Take a look what's happening in Salem. You're going to see rents far in excess of the people who are working here, their ability to afford them. And that's the threat to the character of Salem. So I think we're going to need to attack this in multiple ways, and we'll be back talking to the council next year about what a strong housing agenda looks like for our community. And we'll decide as a community if we're serious about wanting to maintain this diversity that exists. And it's going to take us coming together and addressing sticky issues around how much it costs to build, where we can build, how do we create projects that can address the needs of the people who live and work here and want to stay here. And that's seniors, families, young adults, it's everyone. And that includes market rate. There's lots of folks who want to stay and would love to sell a house and find a unit that works for them. There's a supply and demand here. So I don't think this in and of itself is going to do it. And I think it's going to take a lot of conversations and fortitude for us to tackle this issue as a community.
Other members of the council wish to ask questions? Councilor Milo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would encourage going forward that whenever we talk about housing, because when we talk about affordable housing and market rate, workforce, whatever, the minute I think people start talking about affordable housing in relation to development, there are some ears who hear the silver bullet to solving the problem. What I just heard was it's not even going to come close to solving the problem, that we need additional and, I guess, aggressive housing plans. What I would ask is that as a piece of that plan, we have the other side of it, because we all know that, yeah, and I totally support the idea of building housing as long as we have the commercial base growing to support the housing, and as long as we have that healthy ratio that's going to keep us a healthy city. So I'm just asking, when we have that conversation, can all of that be included in it? Because I don't think it can be just a housing conversation. I think it has to be a comprehensive, holistic city planning kind of thing.
I think there's obviously the need for housing I think it's at a dire state, and we want to try and address that. But we need housing to support the restaurants, to have a thriving downtown, to support the type of retail and environment that we want to have. So they're definitely linked. We need to address transportation. I can't say let's create more housing and not address congestion. It's one of the things we're looking at is the shuttle system and transportation. So these aren't necessarily conversations that take place in silos, but housing takes the longest to get done. And we've got to dig in on it. All of the development that's happening or supposedly happening, there's just a few projects that are actually either completed or under construction. It takes time. And most of what we're seeing is redevelopment in areas that were industrial, older, commercial sites that we wouldn't want back. We wouldn't want back probably a Salem Oil and Grease or a Flintan or a Salem Suede. So the fact that we're able to put some market rate housing on that, those properties will be paying us more in property taxes than they ever paid us as a commercial use. Vincent's Potato Chips on Highland Avenue, commercial use, right? Pays us way more in taxes than it ever did as Hawthorne Commons. Same thing over here with the Parker Brothers site. Now, it doesn't bring the jobs, and I think that's a real legitimate component, and we also want to always try and bring in mixed use. Many of the projects have a commercial component. But for us, right now, housing's a dire need. We need to marry that with livable communities that create that mixed use, and also try and address the congestion and traffic that comes with it. But it's a moral issue. There are people who are not able to afford housing here, and we collectively as a community, we're going to have a lot of packed rooms. If we don't dig in on that, Salem is going to be looking a lot different. I said it'll be Somervilleized, right? If you know Somerville, I remember Slummerville, several years ago. Folks from Somerville are now moving here because they can't afford to stay in Somerville. It's a greater Boston issue. It's not unique to Salem. What I hope will be unique to Salem is that we'll take it on. We'll talk about it. We'll face it as a community. And it's, this is a piece of it, guys. These existing buildings that have been laying fallow for years, many for years, not all, but many, they have an opportunity to be repurposed. How do we embrace that and do that in a way and trust that we have smart people on boards and commissions that can work to address them? I have yet to find a project the planning board's approved that I think is a disaster. And I've been here a long time. I think they do a good job. So I want to let them do that job while having the flexibility to see these sites done. I can't stress, it's not easy to take a historic property. Those lovely courthouses that we own, the SRA owns, those are $50 to $55 million in estimates to redevelop them. So this is not for the faint of heart. But we've got some interest. We got a local community partner who's interested. We need to give them a path forward. This is a path, and I hope it will be embraced.
Say Councilor Dibble, and then Councilor McCarthy, and then Councilor Fury, and then Councilor Medora.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mayor, for being here tonight, and Amanda. I attended both of the informational meetings. They were very good. At the first one, I raised a bunch of questions after reading the draft ordinance a couple of times, and my jaw dropped on the first reading where you could build as tall as the tallest building on the same property. I forget the exact wording, and I immediately thought of where I was married at a Mexican church, or the tall chimneys over at St. James Church, etc. These are buildings on the same property. So do we want to put a building up as tall as a Immaculate Conception steeple where the school is? I thought no. And I raised that concern, and I said, I have a problem with this. The second meeting, it was still in there. And I once again said, I have a problem with this. So I thank you, Amanda, and your boss, Tom, the planner, for listening. Not just to me, there were a lot of other people saying the same thing. So that was good. So I like that you've made changes to this and you've listened. Those informational meetings were good. So thank you. I'm going to rattle off a bunch of concerns, and then I'm going to fly right through them. So if you want to just jot down a couple of notes, you can respond to them all at one time if you want. So the tallest building on the same property doesn't concern me anymore because it's not part of it. And it's quite clear that it doesn't speak to steeples, but it does say ornamental, and I think it should be more structural or something, not just ornamental, because you can say ornamental is too gray. It's too open-ended, I think. When we look at parking on these properties, are we going to be taxing our parking garages further? They're pretty full. And I question Immaculate Conception 1,000 feet would probably cover both parking garages, I think. I don't know if we can absorb it. Extreme density. Do we want to be having a huge number of people living in such a small area without any backyard? Some of these properties are not in the downtown, which that's acceptable to me, but if they're in a residential neighborhood, there should be some green space for the children to go out and run around on. We don't see that on some of the properties, so I'm concerned about that a little bit. We need to balance this overlay zone with protecting the existing neighborhoods and really paying attention to the existing zoning. So we're protecting the neighborhoods. Specifically, a tall building, highly dense, right next to some small single-family houses. I'm just concerned about that. Parking on site. I think I need to reread this for like the 5th time, just to make sure I'm comfortable with the parking requirements in here. Because I don't want to see a dense building go in with very little parking and have the overflow of parking affecting the whole neighborhood with lots of cars out in front of people's houses, nearby houses. I don't have an answer to that one yet. Mayor, you commented tonight the goal is historic preservation of these buildings, and Amanda, you said preserve historic assets. And I agree, let's preserve these buildings. I mean, they're wonderful buildings. So why not make the review of our historic commission mandatory and with teeth instead of just being advisory? I know they're not in some of these buildings are not in the historic zones, but we can make it a requirement and have full review. Mayor, you mentioned the religious facilities citywide. I just don't understand why we're doing this. Are we trying to push religion out of Salem almost? It scares me that we're making it very easy for, and I'm Catholic, making it easy for the archdiocese or other religions just to get out from their buildings really fast. These buildings, most of them were paid for by Salem residents, but the hierarchy of the religious agencies now own these buildings, and they can just close them and sell them and build things on them. I'm concerned that we're making it easier for them to remove God from Salem, and it's just a concern of mine. No, it's a real concern. I question if this ordinance is even needed at all. And you mentioned the use variance that's no longer allowed. Perhaps there's a better vehicle that can achieve the same goals than creating such an ordinance as this. Like you said, 1 and 3 Broad Street, Bowditch School, East and South Branch libraries, and a whole bunch of schools and other buildings were all repurposed successfully, I guess through the use variance that you mentioned. That's how these buildings were redeveloped successfully. And it worked. worked really well. So I don't know if there's a compromise there, that we can have part of that use variance back. I know you said you didn't want it, but it worked for those buildings, and it probably didn't work for a lot of other things that I'm not thinking of. Okay. Councilor Dominguez mentioned the affordable units and the low-income units. I think 10% is just simply too low. We passed an HDIP last week that has no affordable units and no low-income in it at all. Why don't we take advantage of this and put more affordable and/or low-income units as a requirement, rather than just a minimum of 10%? We're talking about potentially creating thousands of housing units, or at least hundreds, in all these 27 properties and probably a bunch of others that we're not aware of. Like somebody mentioned, St. Joseph's School and St. Joseph's Rectory is not on this list. They should be on the list, I think. And get them repurposed. Mary, you're right. Some of these buildings are sitting way too long, not being redeveloped. So if it helps, let's add those two to this list. But the bad impacts of doing some of this and building so many units, we need to talk about the bad traffic that we already have in our aging water system. South Essex Sewage District, can we handle the load? Our schools, impacts to our tax bills. We've heard from a lot of people on all sorts of emails and letters I have here tonight, which I did not have time to read them all, but I read through 3 of them just now. A couple of them were emailed as well, so I thank you for getting them to us early. Well, I don't think we should rush this. This is really, really important. I think it's needed, but I don't think we should rush it. So I'd like to see this public hearing be kept open and be heard right after the holidays so that we can digest it, the planning board can make their recommendations back to us, and we can have time to make changes to the document, because once we pass this, zoning is pretty much permanent. It's tough to make changes later. I question the 30% commercial. Do we want commercial being allowed in some of these properties as of right by this ordinance? I'll yield for now. I have several other concerns, but I think I can address them with Amanda. They're very minor. Thank you, Mr. Chair. If the mayor can kind of address these, I appreciate it.
I think that we'll probably spend some time getting back to you on some of these counselors because it's a long list in the interest of time. But I will just point out a couple of things. Let me just see where I should start with your list, Counselor. So I want to be clear that the ordinance does not incorporate 27 properties. It just makes properties eligible. We went through and looked at the assessor's record, so St. Joseph's may be eligible. It may not have been. It may not have met the minimum threshold requirements. But this idea that this is going to create thousands of units, I want to dissuade you of that. The properties that are on the list of 27 include things like Old Town Hall, City Hall, Bates School. I mean, many of the 27 properties that are eligible are not anywhere close to being vacant or no longer used or surplus. There are 4 that are. The 4 that I mentioned: Senior Center, the two church properties on Hawthorne Boulevard, and St. James. I don't believe this is going to encourage St. Anne's Church, your parish, my parish, to close, right? I don't think this is going to incentivize church closings. If churches are closing, they're closing for reasons that have nothing to do with the value of their buildings. If we do have closed historic properties, though, we'd like a path to see them reused. Right now, there isn't one. Going back to use variances would open up, to me, a Pandora's box of even greater challenges. This is limited to whatever properties are eligible. That's 27. Use variances could be used on any property. That's why we don't do them anymore. I'm not even sure they were legal when they were done many, many years ago. Developers came in and requested it, and the city allowed it to happen, and it wasn't under my watch. It was a different era, different time. Use variances are not something that is traditionally part of zoning allowances. So I would be concerned about that approach. If that's something the council would prefer us to do, is to look at use variances, we'll take that direction. But I have to tell you, I think that it's opening up more trouble than it's worth. You can allow use variances on any property. We're trying to target, obviously, historic preservation. I think this project does everything it can to protect neighborhoods. It's a special permit process. It's not an automatic. You've got a board reviewing it. It's a public process. Everyone will come in. In terms of parking, I think it's a challenge at one of the sites. I don't think it's a challenge at St. James, and we're going to have to wrestle with that together. There are some parking garages close by. There may be some other opportunities looking at spaces the church has for shared parking and what types of uses are going in there. But the building exists. It's infrastructure that's here. If we have to solve whatever goes in there is going to have some kind of a parking demand that we're going to have to work on together. I think we may not be able to completely solve it. And the trade-off is going to be there may be more cars that we're going to have to try and service in that area, but we're going to have housing, and hopefully housing that meets affordable guidelines. I already talked about the 10%. Having a higher threshold may further limit the ability to have these sites developed. The CDC, I think, will welcome more, and if you can get additional housing tax credits and look at that, that may in fact be an option. I would never call these projects extreme density. That's the term that I think you just used. These are existing projects. There's no green space on Hawthorne Boulevard beyond the lovely public green space that exists outside. That's pretty much a downtown site, so I don't know how you'd add green space to a site like that. Perhaps at St. James, there's an opportunity to do that where you have a school and more asphalt. But we have experts here who I think look at these things holistically, impacts, neighborhoods, parking, access, circulation, landscaping, trees, drainage, water, sewer. All of our projects are peer reviewed. We're not just relying on the experts that are board members. We actually have the development team come in and provide what they think they're going to be able to do and have that reviewed by an independent engineering firm to make sure we have capacity. Oftentimes these developments have to pay dollars to improve the infrastructure around them. So sewer pumps, upgrading water lines, Flintan, all that construction on Boston Street, that's a new water line that Flintan's putting in as a result of their project. So we normally leverage these private investments to upgrade some of the infrastructure to make sure we're able to meet these challenges. We could go on and talk about some of these, but I really want to, in the interest of time, give folks an opportunity to comment who've been here a long time. But I'm happy to answer any more questions that councilors have in the meantime. Is there anything you wanted to add, Amanda? Okay.
Councilor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you to the mayor. In the interest of time, could we just have some utilization data for the parking garages? Because, I mean, obviously, the site on Hawthorne Boulevard is very concerning to me, being the ward councilor, with regards to Hawthorne Boulevard itself and Union Street in the back. I mean, Union Street's very narrow, limited parking to begin with. Because the other part of it, the second part of it is that we just saw that the hotel broke ground for their phase 2 and how that's going to impact. I know they've got a long-time lease agreement with the parking lot, the National Grid one on the other side of the Congress Street Bridge, but how that potentially could impact especially the South Harbor garage, because on any given Tuesday or Wednesday, Monday, there may be parking available, but come events, snow emergencies, 4th of July, the list goes on. That garage has been, even on a busy Friday night, shut out, never mind Halloween in the month of October. I'm all in favor, I'm in favor of a huge percentage of what's in here, but with regards to parking, and I know people will come to me and they'll say, oh, this is, it's a different time, but I don't know, I still see people who have, mom has a car, dad has a car, and the kids have a car. And, it's nice to say, until I see a proposal that's going to show me artist communities that, with limited space. Because when I look at, when you look at the table, you got to take everything as it comes together. You look at the table and it says minimum lot area per dwelling, 500 square feet. That's an artist. That's a bed and a bath and a common area and not much more. That's a very small space, but which may work in certain situations. So but that goes to these guys on the other side of the room when they permit it. But for me, it's if we can just get some data on the utilization of the garage, I'll leave it at that.
The benefit of having the system that we have is that we have all that data, and I know there's definitely capacity, but you're correct, and is it at the right times, right?
Yep.
So happy to share that.
Thank you.
Councilor Fury.
Mayor, I'm very excited by the opportunity of this overlay zone. As a retired school teacher, 40 years. I am now working full-time at the PBS Museum, 40 hours, $12.50. I am also a city council at large, $13,500 as a city councilor. I'm retiring this next election. I remember going to the hearings when the Archdiocese came in about the old St. Joseph's Church, And they said to the people, some of us who were in this room, that the new development at St. Joseph's would be good for retired firefighters, retired teachers to stay in Salem, sell their home or maybe stay in Salem. I see this as an opportunity for myself, a retired school teacher, we have a fireman here, other professionals here, to stay in Salem. I want to stay in Salem. I love Salem. I cannot afford the rents. Sincerely, I'm a human face. I'm working 40 hours a week after retirement, 70 years of age. I'll be working for the rest of my life, sincerely. And many of us will when we retire. Retiring. There's no retirement at 62 years old anymore, or 64, 66, Social Security, Medicare, and all that stuff. We'll be working multiple jobs. This is a critical help to the city of Salem. Old infrastructure, an old challenging city of 8 square miles that I love, and I've served for 35 years. And I will miss dearly being in the city council chamber. But I think this overlay district is long overdue. It's a catalyst for people like myself and people in this room to stay in Salem. Rent, condominiums, whatever it may be. I taught 30 years at St. James, school itself. My family went to the IC. And I remember using the long council on aging. These are challenging facilities. Even the facility of St. Anne's, possibly on this, all need this catalyst. So this overlay is a catalyst. This is the magic bullet, the silver bullet, not necessarily, but we need it more than ever. I need it personally. Can I work to 90 years old? Still rent in Salem? No. We need this zone for people to stay in Salem who love Salem. And I love Salem, and I want to stay here. And I thank you for the opportunity.
Counselor?
Councilor Madore? No, you're all set.
Response, no.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mayor and Amanda, I have a few questions. I'll try and get through them quickly. First, I want to address affordability. I think the 10% is a good number, but I think the bigger issue is the affordability level itself. I'd like to see that we decrease the 80% of area median income to 50 or anything below 80, because we all know that 80% of AMI is too high still for Salem's local needs. And related to that, in earlier versions of this draft ordinance, I remember seeing that the language in particular to affordability had mentioned the inclusionary ordinance that we are currently trying to draft. So why was that left out? Because if we're going to set something, if we're going to adopt an ordinance that provides higher affordability, then having this language here might create an opportunity for developers to provide lower affordability as a result, because they can choose the lower to provide fewer
It
affordable
would depend
units.
on the wording of the inclusionary housing ordinance. We could make that supersede
Okay.
anything that's here. So.
I just want to point that out because I remember earlier versions had that language specifically. So in terms of the zoning itself, Amanda, earlier you said that this overlay is an option. The developer can still choose to use the underlying zoning. But if we're saying that these uses are already exempt and there's no permitting pathway for these buildings to be redeveloped, then they have to they have to use the overlay. So if they use the underlying zoning, does that mean they have to do a complete tear down and use the underlying zoning?
Yes.
Okay, so the option is, there is no option. You
No.
have to use the overlay in order to redevelop these properties.
Unless they wanted to put 2 units in the
Right.
old Boys and Girls Club, right? Or
But
just
even-
the size of the building.
But even
You wouldn't meet the
then,
setbacks, yeah. You're
but
right.
even then, it would still be going from an exempt use to a single or two-family,
Yeah.
which we can't do.
Right, you wouldn't be able to meet the setbacks. You're right, you would have to tear them down to meet the underlying zoning.
Unless you're in a B5. In the B5, you can make the standards work.
So anything in R1 or R2, like the St. James or 5 Broad Street properties, without this overlay, you would have to do a complete tear down in order to move forward,
Yeah.
is what you're saying.
Yep. And on senior center site, what, 3 units max would be able to go there, I think?
Okay.
So,
In regards to parking, Mayor, you were saying earlier that very few of these properties would meet the minimum requirements for new construction. Is that correct? And,
With respect to parking?
well, you're saying that these properties would have to
Right,
meet.
right. The underlying
a
zoning is
long
R1
list-
or R2, correct?
Right, long list of requirements before they can actually meet the dimensions required for parking and all the different provisions for new construction.
Any new addition on
Any
these
new addition,
properties?
any
Yes.
construction. So, under parking, it provides a way for redevelopments to meet those parking requirements off-site. So if they're able to use that to meet the parking requirements to get over the threshold of new construction, could they potentially use that as a loophole to create
Meaning
new
that
construction?
you would claim the parking garage downtown to build a new addition on Hawthorne Boulevard, for instance?
Yeah, so say if they don't have enough space on site to meet the parking requirements, can they say, well, we're gonna provide the parking requirements off-site and build new construction?
That you were in 1,000 feet of a municipal facility?
Yes. Would it be
You
possible?
could.
Yeah, if you do not exceed the 50% lot coverage and you can make your parking work, if you have parking off-site, then I wouldn't consider it a loophole. I would consider that a way of meeting your parking requirements.
I think my question is more geared towards whether a developer could game the ordinance and say, well, we meet all the requirements in the table, and therefore we could build an addition or a separate building.
And use a public garage to
And use the
park,
public
right?
garage instead
Right.
of providing
Yeah.
parking on site.
So that would meet the parking accommodations, right? But you'd have to be within the 1,000 feet, and the only site that's in the 1,000 feet would be the Hawthorne building, right, at present.
So St. James wouldn't qualify?
Well, what would be the municipal parking facility?
The
Bridge Street.
former web lot, maybe?
Universal lot would be within
Is that 1,000 feet? Yeah.
Could be.
I mean, so I guess I would say to you, there is a backstop to all of this, the planning board, special permit. So, I mean, I think it's, we allow that ordinance within the B5, because we don't want parking garages on every corner, right? We want to be able to have housing above buildings and recognize that people can park in the parking garage, and that qualifies as parking as opposed to building a garage on every corner. That's been in place as part of urban renewal, and that's how that policy first emanated. This mimics this a little bit, but the intention is certainly not to enable somebody to, instead of redeveloping their site, add an addition, and then I'm going to go get my parking down at the public facility. That's the goal of this is preservation, and any new addition would be there because it's supporting the preservation of the building, not because it's an opportunity to enhance revenues and tie it to a public parking need. So, I'm trying to identify the site that would even work, I guess. I wasn't thinking about the Universal Steel Shop being within 1,000 feet distance.
Okay. And lastly, under 8.7.5, uses allowed by special permit, it says that the commercial gross floor area for commercial uses should not exceed 30%. I wonder if you could add language to say that it must be on a ground floor. If you're open to that. Only because I think it would kind of take away the intent of the ordinance itself.
Could you say that one more time, Counselor? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
The
commercial use?
commercial uses may only be located within a multifamily dwelling and may not exceed 30% of the gross
Yep.
floor area. And I was hoping it would, I'd like to see it limited to the ground floor only. Rather than having office spaces spread throughout the building and mixing with residential units, because that could potentially kind of take away the intent, which is to, preserve the historical preservation intent of the ordinance, and also we want to make sure that there's really strong language to provide housing production.
Yeah, that makes sense.
If I could follow up on your question there on that before, the one place where that might have a conflict would be if you use, say, one of these properties, if we did have artist spaces as one of those, because I think that might qualify as a commercial use. But even though it's a mixed kind of commercial and residential use, it's sort of a special case. But if you took, like, for instance, a building like Porter Mill over in Beverly, which is the closest place that does lofts, artist studios, lofts right now, they have a residential component to the building, but they also have workspaces all throughout there, and it's on multiple floors. So that you might want to have if you're going to modify that requirement, you might want to also accommodate the artist loft use, where you do have live/workspaces. Just a thought.
So maybe that's where the special permit process comes in for the artist use specifically. It's up to the planning board to determine whether it's a compatible use for the building.
You would think you would want the planning board reviewing these holistically, and if a commercial use isn't going to work on the upper floors, that they would be able to call that out at the time in terms of circulation and access. So, I mean, I'd also think we need to think about the end users here in terms of the ability to get financing and where these projects are going to go. It's primarily going to be housing, with the exception of things like the artist live work concept that is being discussed for Salem Boulevard.
That's all I have.
Thank you. Councilor Milo had a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just piggybacking on the Ward 2 councilor's question about additional alternative paths, or are there additional alternative paths, or is this zoning the only, or overlay the only path? If we looked at the non-conforming uses and structures and added exempt properties to that, would that help?
Pre-existing non-conforming uses. I mean, many of these non-conforming buildings have been vacant for more than 2 years, so they wouldn't have a pre-existing non-conforming use to tie off of. We could certainly look at it, Counselor, but you'd be creating a special permit process going back to the ZBA in that case, right?
Right. And then I would piggyback on that then you don't have the design review board and the historical commission review that you have under this ordinance.
Yeah, so you miss out on additional lines.
10%
affordable, right?
Yeah, okay, all right. And then one other question that's not related to the question that I just asked. Affordable housing inventory. When we look at Salem's affordable housing inventory, do we consider vouchers? Do we add vouchers to that inventory? The federal vouchers where people are living in,
not
private
only if they're
apartments?
project-based. If they're mobile, I don't believe they count.
Right.
So if it's a project-based subsidy tied to a specific property, it
So it's
calculates
bricks
towards...
and mortar, in other words?
Correct.
Yeah, okay, all right. But we know that those other ones exist.
Yeah, there's definitely folks who have a voucher that's called like more of a mobile voucher where they
Yeah.
can use it in any
Right.
community. I'm sure there are some, but because it's not tied to the specific property,
You can't track it,
DHCD
yeah.
doesn't allow you to count it towards your 10%. I
Because they
mean, we
could
are
be
over
using
our
it in
10%
California.
threshold
Yeah.
for 40B. That's the only trigger around that that particular
Thank
use.
you.
Any other members of the council have questions? I'll open up the planning board. Any questions from the planning board? No? Seeing none, I'll open this up for public comment. I'm going to start with the right side of the room and go around all the way to the left. So I will start if anybody wants to comment from to my right. Don't all run up at once. We'll start going in order. We'll start down here. Lori, I think you're the first one with your hand up, so. Go up to the speaker? Yep, yes, please, and then name and address for the record, even though we all know you. And sign on the sheet there if you haven't already.
Okay. Laura Lee Stewart, 7 Barnes Road in Salem. I'm here tonight in support of the overlay, specifically because these buildings are mostly empty and have seen their days, and I think that the case for affordable housing in Salem has been made and will be made over the next couple of months. We're going to see a 9% increase in our population by 2030, and we don't have the housing for that population. In addition to that, 46% of renters in Salem, or not necessarily renters, but people are overburdened on paying more than 30% of their income on their rent. So those are some really stark figures, and for those reasons, I'm in favor of this.
Thank you. All right, next, Jen, and then...
Hi, Jen Lynch, 38 Charles Street, Salem. Housing is sorely needed in Salem. The market's saturated in pricing out the communities that make this a desirable place to live. I think this is just one part of a multi-pronged effort to address affordability, and I'm in favor. Thank you.
Pat?
Patrick Deulis, 6 Seymour Street, Salem. I also want to voice my support for the overlay ordinance, and I would encourage the council to take into consideration not putting additional restrictions and burdens on something that's intended to make the development easier. And I know there are some groups that want additional oversight and additional permitting approvals. I think that might be a little misguided. I spent 2 hours driving around with a commercial broker in Revere today, showing me all of the development that is occurring in Revere. Most of it housing, some of it veteran, some of it affordable, because the city is very proactive in pushing that housing program. So the city can get behind a housing push if the will is there. And, you know, projects such as these are isolated. The problem is more widespread and requires a citywide effort. So I would not say hold these 2 projects hostage because we have a housing problem that nobody thinks is solvable. It's solvable, but you have to start, and this is a good start.
Thank you. Jeff?
Jeff Cohen, 12 Hancock Street, also the Vice Chair of Salem Sustainability, Energy, and Resiliency Committee. I am of support of this ordinance. However, I do think it could be enhanced. In the language, it says environmental sustainability and resilience. Sustainability is more than just the environment. I think we can combine things. I don't have a magic bullet, but I'm going to try to express an idea that might come close. I do believe, as some of the councilors said, that 10% affordability is too low, and 80%, as Councilor Madore said, is too high of the median. If you establish a minimum, you're only going to meet the minimum. That's it. No one's going to exceed the minimum. Resiliency is not building an extra floor necessarily. That's safety, and that's important, and we need to do that for the safety of the residents. However, sustainability goes further than that. We passed a 100% clean energy resolution. We're the first community in Massachusetts to do so. We need to find ways to get to that point, and it's a combination of planning and zoning and everyone else. We need to be relevant as sustainability and resiliency advocates. Here's an idea. If you are concerned about meeting 10% because the developer may not be able to afford it, you could mandate a higher percentage, but you can also mandate certain sustainability requirements. For example, the tax laws that were passed this year, which I disagree with mostly, changed the depreciation allowance significantly. If a development like this had an appreciable amount of solar panels, for example, I know a little bit about solar panels in the city, the depreciation is now 100% to be realized in the first year. which means the federal government would pay for about 50% of the project in the first year. That can cover a lot of reaching a higher amount of affordability for housing. If you live, as the mayor put it, if you work in Salem, you should be able to live here. We shouldn't just look at things in individual boxes. As planning, the most important thing is how do we plan for the future? How do we get to a place where we're sustainable and resilient? One way is to mandate sustainability and resiliency in projects. It's really important for people who think that that's more expensive. However, a more sustainable, resilient building is financially more beneficial. You can realize a higher return on investment that you would if you didn't include those things. So if you mandate these things, we can have this overlay, it can be successful, and we can have a higher percentage of lower income housing than is in this ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you. Deasy, and then we'll...
Good evening. T.C. Roddy Goggin, 9 Wisteria Street. First, I would like to go on record to say that the 45 minutes that we waited for a quorum for the planning board should not have happened. It did, and there's nothing more that we can do about it. But as I say, I wanted to go on record. That's my first thing. Second, the overlay on these pages. I'm not for it, I'm not against it. It never should have happened. Why, you say? I say majority of you are here, unless you are a psychic, unless you can predict the future, then you have no right to toy with 27 pieces of property and some of the others also. Some of the people that you've listed here find fault and feel as if they have been offended by appearing on a list. This is not the first time that I've seen this happen in the city within the past 12 years. It happened throughout the city when the first time we ever heard of a PUD, a planned unit development. And when people came to the planning department, many of you were not on the board at the time, people came because their property, yes, their property was on the list, and they wanted to know why. They were not notified, some of them at the time, some of them were. People on this list that I checked with, they were not notified that they were going to be on a list. People are upset to think that maybe their library, what's going to happen to it? I would like to go to each and every one of you and have a cup of coffee and ask you exactly to explain what is on these papers and what it's all about. Some of you know and some of you don't. But I will tell you this right now, that some people, when they betray other people, they might be paid with 30 pieces of silver. If you indeed, tonight and with the planning board's recommendation, in other words, if you close the public hearing, first of all, that's wrong. It shouldn't happen that way. But indeed, if you do, you will be betraying, yes, you will be betraying your constituents because you don't know what you're voting. You can't know. You can't plan when a child is born where their wedding will be, or how much you'll pay for the wedding, or where they'll go to college. No more than you can plan when something is going to happen. In 2008, here in the city of Salem, we had builders who had buildings that they had, and they had permits for them. You even allowed the permits to be held over. You're calling for on this ordinance that shouldn't exist. The mayor has said to you tonight, special permit. When you hear special, beware. And as I say once again, 30 pieces of silver, you will be replaced for your payment for this act. 30 pieces of fool's gold. Thank you.
Emily Udy, 8 Buffum Street, and speaking on behalf of Historic Salem. I believe that you got a letter that we sent, which I'm supposed to read, but I'm actually going to sort of address some of the things that were talked about tonight. First of all, I think it is unfair to pit affordable housing versus this ordinance, or let me just say housing specifically. Historic Salem has a long history of supporting housing in historic buildings, specifically schools, and as has been mentioned, there's in many neighborhoods in the city there are schools that have been turned into housing. an overlay is an option to reuse, and it's the option that the planning board has chosen. The specifics of this overlay are not the specifics for an overlay district. They were selected, and I hope can be up for debate. I would like to ask if there is the ability to edit the ordinance in this process, because certainly we support the reuse of historic buildings. And we support the stated goal, which is to minimize impacts on surrounding neighborhoods, but the specifics of the ordinance that were selected are problematic, specifically the dimensional allowances. It's been clearly stated that B5 zoning was, B5 dimensional requirements were what this ordinance was based on. And I appreciate that clarity. I disagree with that because these are in generally residential 1 and 2, or the ones that are in residential neighborhoods. It doesn't make sense to me to put downtown-like zoning in these residential neighborhoods. So I think that there can be some changes to the dimensional overlays that make a lot more sense. A developer, because he or she is going to be trying to maximize their return, is going to build as big as they can. That makes sense. So let's make sure that they're not building something that's drastically bigger than the surrounding neighborhoods. We've watched these old buildings sit empty, and we've watched them crumble. We want to see them reused. There is a model ordinance, a best practices put out by the National Trust that is written for adaptive reuse of historic buildings. And it focuses on allowing the flexibility for zoning in the existing building, which is necessary. And the buildings they're cool buildings. Schools want to be condos, and people want to live in those condos. The concern is with the allowed new construction. I understand that the new construction might be necessary to make it feasible. It makes sense that new construction would be required to meet the adjacent zoning, so that the old building has the flexibility, and any new construction does not get the favorable zoning. So I hope that you can consider making adjustments to the ordinance so that we can get this housing, so that we can get these buildings reused, but that the stated intent of minimizing the impacts to surrounding neighborhoods can be realized. And then I just want to speak a little bit more about intent, which is the intent of this ordinance has been stated frequently. It needs to be clearly written in the ordinance, because this is not just an ordinance for this year or next year. It's until someone else comes along and tries to change it. That could be 20, that could be 30 years. We don't know who's going to be on the planning board in 20 years. And we don't know what developers are going to come in 20 years. We want to make sure that the intent is codified in the ordinance. So I ask you, especially the experts, to look at exactly what's written and make sure that the intent is going to be realized with what's written. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to be clear, before I bring the next person up, the planning board can recommend modifications to the ordinance within certain bounds of the zoning ordinance. The city council can also do those when they come back to us. We can accept those. We can add others. So there is some. This is not a take it, look at it, pass it, send it back, we pass it or fail it. That's that. There is some flexibility in that regard. So
Great.
just want to make sure that's clear.
Important, so I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, Barbara Cleary, 104 Federal Street. I think I already signed up. I'm speaking solely as myself, although I did have a hand in some of the historic comments. I just want to speak a little bit to what Teasy said and what Emily said, which is, I really think when you read this ordinance, you have to think about the law of unintended consequences. These are a lot of sites. They're almost all in R1 and R2 neighborhoods. These are almost all historic neighborhoods. We're putting, for new construction, essentially B5 zoning. It's maybe not quite as high, but that's what the density is. You don't really have adequate setbacks. So we don't have design review as a requirement, we don't have historic commission review as a requirement. We have the special permit authority, which is not a very high threshold, and I have never seen the planning board, with all the good work you do, ever make a building smaller as part of their special permit. Maybe it has happened, but not since kind of I've been around. So if we're relying on the planning board to make something be lower than St. James, you have to understand that you could build at the height of the St. James Church, which is in the McIntyre Historic District. So I would strongly recommend that we simply follow the National Trust model, which has been used all across the country, which says the underlying zoning is what governs new construction. And they're very clear on that. And our ordinance is a complete opposite, which says you get to do all this stuff in new construction, which is not what the National Trust model says. So, and I'm glad to hear that there might be some discussion. I would encourage keeping the public hearing open so there can be continued dialogue, so that we can get an ordinance that really works for these historic properties and can get these buildings reused. Thank you.
Jessica Herbert, 70 Webb Street. I have brand new glasses, so I'm kind of googly-eyed, but I'm going to try to read this. Anyway, I'd like to speak to the new construction component of this proposed ordinance. My personal experience with historic rehabilitation and reuse of City of Salem historic schools includes the condominium conversion, which I completed in 1987 of the Cogswell School, and also in 1989 of the Old Salem Normal School at 1 Broad Street. So these two historic structures were completed respecting the historic buildings in the surrounding neighborhoods and the campuses without any new construction component. They were also completed under the old way of doing this, which is a special permit for change of use, which I guess we can no longer do. My concern as chair of the Historic Commission, I'm actually speaking for myself, but just to identify who I am, is that any new construction of any of the properties that are identified under this ordinance be of design and materials compatible with their surrounding neighborhoods. While the height and mass of any potential new construction will be determined by the final zoning constraints, the design and materials in each individual case, and there are individual cases, will either make or break the success of integrating this new construction within the community. Therefore, I think it's critical that the Historic Commission have inclusive jurisdiction over any new construction to the properties affected under this ordinance. And I do think this is a great start. I think it needs more work, but I think we're headed in the right direction. So I'm just putting it. Thank you.
It's actually good timing. Hi, Fred Biebesheimer, 17.5 River Street. I'm all for historic preservation, and I could support an overlay ordinance in some form. I have a hard time, for a lot of the reasons that have been brought up by others already, supporting this one as it's currently written. And I'll just focus in on one aspect of it, and it relates to the new construction. I think making it feasible to reuse a school or building an unused church property or whatever it may be is great, and I think it actually enhances a community. I have a problem with the way the wording of this ordinance seems to me to have too many loopholes in it, and from what I've seen, if there's a loophole in an ordinance, a developer is going to take advantage of it, and once it's written in law, you no longer have any say in it, and it's not just no say at one particular location, but it's potentially no say in it for all these locations. Apparently there may have been some that we haven't identified. A number of us put together, and the big one concern I have is the wording that says an addition or alteration to an existing building shall not exceed the height of the existing building or applicable underlying zoning, whichever is greater. So I interpret that to mean it's either the underlying zoning, which may be 5 stories or whatever, or the height of the existing building, whichever is greater, which means, and I made up, a number of us made together some hypothetical scenarios by which that could be interpreted by a developer. So these are a number of the properties that we've talked about here. These are not meant to represent what the building would look like or how many stories it is or whatnot, but it's really more to suggest what a developer might try to do with respect to the mass of the building, the height of the building, and kind of a loophole that could get around to take what should be an ordinance to help develop the actual original building into something valuable to the community, and really take advantage of a loophole here to really build something that I don't think is intended by this ordinance, and that's very concerning to me. So I would hope that this could be reworded to make it a little more clear what you can and can't do with respect to additions. That's my concern for this. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul?
Polly Wilbert, 7 Cedar Street. I think there's an important question that you as the City Council need to answer. What should be built in Salem for the city to be a balanced and viable community for the long term? If you, the City Council, don't determine that this hearing is putting the cart before the horse. The state, through the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, has said that Salem should add 2,700 new units of housing by 2030 to meet population growth. Has the council asked, is that the right number for us to add? And how many units have been added to date? And how fast should we add new housing? And what kind of housing should it be? From my review, we have added, permitted, or have under review more than 1,400 units of housing, very little of which has been affordable. We have already added close to 100 new hotel rooms, with another 100 on the way at the Hampton Inn. At Salem State, we've added 1,325 dorm rooms. Importantly, I am not confident that we know whether we are successfully absorbing what we have already built or permitted or have under review. Do we truly know that Salem's electrical grid, water and sewer and roadways can sustain what's happening? Did your power fail a few evenings ago? Ours did in South Salem. Does the council fully understand the impacts from what has already been permitted is being added now? In the Great Salem Fire, 1,792 buildings were burned to the ground, which included 407 places of business. So it is fair to note that not since that devastating fire have we built at this rate. At the beginning of 2009, we had just under 25,000 motor vehicles registered here. Last week, the city assessor's office told me that we now have over 36,000. You do the math. At the budget retreat last January, the mayor told the council that we had fewer vehicles registered. It isn't true. We need to ask, is the housing we are building solving our housing needs or Boston's? The MAPC also projected that our greatest growth will be people aged 65 to 74, from 2,670 in 2010 to nearly double 5,100 in 2030. The Salem Housing Authority manages just 715 units and has a multiple years long wait list. In Salem, it is a fact that if you're a senior, you could die before you get into Salem housing. In fact, Salem seniors are receiving emergency vouchers for housing in other communities. And our seniors are being forced out of their homes because rents here are escalating at rocket speeds. Does this ordinance promote significant affordable senior housing? Specifically, it does not. In wealthy communities all around us, housing in the numbers and densities that Salem is undertaking is not happening. In many of those towns, affordable housing developments are being blocked. Those communities don't want to undertake the headlong development that is happening here. In fact, they are very likely saying, let Salem do it. Is that right? In Boston, Mayor Walsh, also at the behest of the MAPC, determined to build 55,000 units of housing by 2030. He recently announced that those units will be built by 2020. He has now moved the goal to 69,000 units of housing in Boston by 2030. Meanwhile, the housing permitted in Boston has not reduced the pressure on Salem as we continue to mitigate their housing problem, as well as those of Cambridge and Somerville and the like. What are we doing in Salem when we lock in housing and not work sites? Are we attracting and promoting business development with the same efforts as housing, or are we doing a poor job of it? If so, why is that? Is that what we want? The overlay decision that you are considering tonight permits aggressively large new construction and significant densities that don't solve Salem's particular housing needs. Rather, they address deficits in other cities. The council needs to ask this question: is Boston's affordable housing being built in Salem? Through our recent zoning decisions, we are locking in housing, not jobs. These decisions are defining Salem as a place to live and from which we have to leave to work. Our neighbors commute hours to and from their jobs. We are not focusing on balancing development for both housing and work in Salem. We don't spend anywhere near the time and effort to promote job creation here as we do reviewing the applications of housing developers to build, build, build. I believe that Salem can create a process to effectively preserve our historic buildings for reuse without adding the significant downside impacts of very dense new construction for housing, chiefly in already dense historic neighborhoods. This overlay district proposal is not that. Councilors, please make sure that any new Salem zoning truly addresses Salem's needs, even if that means going back to the drawing board with this ordinance. Finally, please leave this hearing open while deliberations evolve on this issue so that input from the good citizens of Salem will be considered. There is nothing in Section 5 of Chapter 40A that requires that a hearing be closed during deliberations. I just want to also make a point about the list. The list was to give us an understanding of the kinds of buildings that were going to be covered by this ordinance. By saying the list is not part of the ordinance, it's a little bit disingenuous. Darlene Mellis isn't here tonight. She was a member of the school committee, building committee for many years. The 4 schools that are on that list took state financing. They are required to remain schools for 50 years because of that financing. To have those buildings on that list, to assume that this is going to make an impact on those buildings is not fair to us to understand how this ordinance will work. I think it's important for the citizens of Salem, when they're given a list, to understand that it's a valid list. So I ask you to make sure that we understand to what and how does this ordinance apply, and if the list is not exemplary of those situations, then that's not right. Thank you.
Hi, Jeff Millar, 29 Boardman Street. I'd like to start by saying that I'm very supportive of giving developers a path to redevelop and save some of these buildings that have been sitting vacant, and in the case of the building on Hawthorne Boulevard, it sounds like it was falling down when it was last being used. So I think that's an important thing for us to do. I have some devil in the details concerns about some of what I've heard and read. First, on the use of municipal parking, I don't think I'm supportive of that. And it also feels like something that's a spot zone when you read it, and it requires that monthly passes be available for purchase, and that's how they meet the parking requirement. And there's only one property, I think, on the list that is close enough to municipal parking facilities that sell monthly passes currently to make that happen. I also think if you talk to any of the downtown residents who live in buildings, and I think there's a couple in this room, where they are required to purchase monthly passes in parking garages, they have found that it does not really meet their needs. So I would consider striking that from the ordinance in its entirety. And just like Polly, actually, I'm gonna go to the list. I read the list and I immediately had a few questions about, well, why is that on there? Why is that not on there? And I think it's important that we really have really well-defined criteria for what does or doesn't qualify. Using Bridget 211, for example, yes, that is a building that has been used as a church. It's already being reused, and it's no longer a house of worship. For another example, the Satanic Temple on Bridge Street was built in, I believe it was 1882, and is just over 3,100 square feet, and is currently a house of worship, though it does not appear on the list. And if you're familiar with that organization, they tend to dislike it greatly when they are not treated like other religious organizations. So there may be some issues with that. I would go to the Museum Place Mall. I don't think it's quite 50 years old yet, but it's well over 3,000 square feet, and it currently, I believe currently still has a church in it. Doesn't appear on the list. They could make an argument that they would qualify for that as well. You know, I think it's important that when we look at that list of 27 properties, we know how accurate it is or it isn't, and whether or not there are any other unintended consequences or properties that we would be adding to the list. Thank you.
Justin Whittier, 10 River Street. I just want to ask as well that you keep this public hearing open. I couldn't find anything in the laws that suggests that there's a requirement for it to be closed. And I would say unless you can find a specific requirement that it must be closed, then you should follow the previous custom and leave it open. So this ordinance, as I see it, in order to find a path forward for 3 or 4 buildings, we put 27 properties in the crosshairs of potential development. There may not be any plans now, but we don't know what the future will hold, and what this will do is create a pathway and an incentive for redevelopment. If this were only about finding a way to redevelop existing buildings, I don't think you'd find much opposition. But I find it ironic and troubling that the purpose of this ordinance is to reuse these buildings in a way which will, quote, minimize impacts to surrounding neighborhoods. And yet, it allows for 4 or potentially 5-story buildings, additions to the full height of existing buildings like St. James Church, density 15 to 30 times greater than what will mostly be included in this ordinance, which is R1 and R2, 15 or 30 times greater density, and potentially 0 parking. That doesn't sound to me like minimizing the impacts to surrounding neighborhoods. Now, obviously, this won't happen with every site, but I would suggest that 1 is too many. This ordinance is based on, as I understand it, the National Trust Model Ordinance. But it differs from it in several key ways. Essentially, the National Trust Model Ordinance says, you know, you can make these renovations to existing buildings, but any expansions of the floor area, any additions must comply with the standards of the underlying zone. So if you're going to redevelop something in R2, you want to put an addition on, it has to comply with R2. There's no provision in that for new freestanding buildings. This would allow you to build 4 or 5-story new buildings with, as we know, very large density. Setbacks. The National Trust model would say existing setbacks may remain, but no further encroachments shall be permitted. This would allow just the opposite. There's basically no setback protections in this ordinance for new construction. So, as I say, essentially, if this were limited to provisions for reusing the existing buildings, I would support it. I think most people would. But the provisions for new construction as they stand are far too large. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
David Friedberg, 57 Britannia Circle. I'm here to support this both personally and professionally, and I'd like to read a letter from the North Shore Association of Realtors, as I am a member of the Government Affairs Committee. As a voice of real estate on the North Shore and as advocates of homeownership and the rights of private property owners, the North Shore Association of Realtors, which is comprised of 1,300 members, including 100 Salem residents, encourages support of the proposed zoning ordinance establishing a municipal and religious adaptive reuse overlay district. This ordinance provides for historic preservation while helping to meet the growing need for housing in Salem, especially for senior and affordable units. As realtors, we know firsthand that the North Shore is in need of increased housing stock. We understand that no community can sustain a desirable quality of life without meeting its residents' basic needs for housing. Given that there is no permitting pathway or mechanism to allow for the preservation or reuse of these religious and municipal buildings as currently situated, the North Shore Association of Realtors recommends that the Planning Board and City Council adopt this ordinance, which would establish sufficient oversight and flexibility to incentivize the reuse of the current and potentially underutilized properties in a beneficial manner to the community. The North Shore Association of Realtors commends the City of Salem for its continued efforts to amend present zoning that would otherwise constrain or fail to accommodate opportunities for further housing production. And to you as well, Madam Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lindsay Morcillo, 53 Broad Street, Salem, Massachusetts. I rise to speak in favor of this ordinance. As one of the earlier speakers said, the devil is in the details. I think, of course, as with any legislation, that's true here as well. I think you're getting a chance through this public hearing to get a lot of good information and viewpoints. But on the other hand, do keep in mind that time marches forward. And if nothing is done, these buildings will continue to lie fallow. And that does no one any good. There will be senior housing needs, affordable housing needs that would go unmet if nothing is done, if this issue isn't moved forward at all. And so that's really what I think the key is. And I don't necessarily envy you for having to work at the details, but I also have faith that you can do that. So thank you very much.
Anybody else in the hallway?
Hi, Josiah Fisk, 358 Essex Street, business address 10 Derby Square. I agree with much of what has been said here tonight. I think everyone seems to be in favor of historic preservation. I'm in favor of it. I think there are a lot of problems with this. I think that essentially this is, to some extent, taking historic preservation and holding it hostage to other opportunities without which we don't know much about. We have some sense of what they could be, but I think it's pretty clear that in some cases what no one wants, what is allowable by right or not by right, but would be allowable under the restrictions of this. And so that tells me that this is a flawed document in that sense. There's no reason to have this permit things that no one would ever want. I think there is some difficulty in how this came about. It seems to have come about, from what I can tell, from the need to have a vehicle to deal with 3 properties, which need to be dealt with. We all agree with that. But then there's been tried to sort of an effort to extrapolate that into principles, and then what happens when we apply the principles? We end up with this list, except the list isn't exhaustive. We don't really know what's on the list or what's off the list. Things like town hall and the library are on the list. Is that really what we want? Things like the buildings and the parks are not on the list because it seems, I'm guessing, that the list addresses the piece of property that something is on, not just the building. And so in order to be able to designate a building in a park, which perhaps something would want to be done with, you would have to designate the whole park, so now the parks are out, but things like Old Town Hall are in. I don't really think that's very well thought through. I don't think the principles are very good, and I don't think it is adequate ever to say, well, that'll never happen or this will never happen. We don't know what will ever happen. And I think a lot more care needs to be taken to make sure that things that we really don't want to have happen are prevented by this. And I think that the unintended consequences are serious. One of the things that I do in my work is to draft legal documents. And if you draft a legal document, what you have to do is to read it as if you were the opposition, or read it in this case as if you were a developer trying to maximize your opportunities. And when you do that with this, you find quite a lot of opportunity. Again, things that I think, it tells me that it was not really read in this way because you wouldn't have written it that way. there are things that are very unclear. It's 5 stories, or 4 stories, 5 stories with parking underneath, or it's 50 feet, or it's the height of the building. If it's the height of the building, if it's St. James Church, and let's say the church at some point, not hoping this happens, but this is supposed to be something that takes care of the future. If any building like this becomes converted to a different use, does that height mean 4 stories with very high units because you're limited to 4 stories? Does it mean the height of the roof? Where's the height measured from? Is it measured from the uphill side or the downhill side? Is it measured to the corners? Is it measured to the peak of the roof? Is it an average? What is the height? Doesn't say. We don't know anything about any of that stuff. And that's the kind of thing that leaves just a big loophole for anyone to try to interpret it. Oh, well, the height of the building, we're just going to continue the ridge. That sounds perfectly reasonable. You didn't say we couldn't, so apparently we can. I think there's some real concerns in that area. I don't envy the person who has to do the drafting on this, but I think that there's a lot of work ahead to try to really consider that, because you are trying to extrapolate something from these 3 properties and apply it to these other areas. That work has to be done, or we're all going to live with the consequences. I'm also very concerned about what appears to me to be the loss of direct public input. There are typically hearings, or would be typically hearings with this. I'm not saying that we should have a process that is cumbersome and inefficient, as perhaps it has been for properties like this. But I'm also not saying that I think that just having city boards approve and not having any opportunity for the public input, I think that's a mistake. For the public, we're the people who've already come here and invested money. It's private property rights. We are private property owners, and this affects our value and our quality of life and our real estate values. We have rights as well. And the reason that public hearings like this happen is because it is recognized that we have an interest, that we're as a community, and that things like this happen and affect people nearby, and that's why they get to have a say in it. I really, but I think that we need to look much more closely at what we are losing in that regard under this. I think it's very possible to support the goals of this and still have a lot of trouble with that aspect of it. I think I just want to say, also I want to echo the concern to leave the hearing open if possible. It seems to have been a custom in Salem in the past. I don't see any reason why it can't be. And I think, again, we don't know what opportunities to comment might come up. I think that would be important to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else in the hallway wish to come in and speak?
I guess we'll start working our way down the room, starting from the door. Okay, John.
So I'm going to be uncharacteristically brief. John Carr, 7 River Street. I'm a lawyer here in Salem. My office is at 9 North Street. The one thing I want to target is that this is a significant and comprehensive piece of legislation. I've been practicing law for 41 years. I have been active, very active, in preservation efforts. I was on the Historic Commission for its first 25 years. I was principally responsible for creating each of the historic districts. I applaud the goal of preservation, and I welcome many of the goals. But I hear that one of the goals of this legislation is to create affordable housing. And then I hear, but it's not going to do that. And I hear that we live in a city from the mayor that we're not going to need a car. And then I hear from Polly Wilbert that cars have actually increased from 26,000 to 36,000, while parking has almost commensurately declined, and I won't cite any specific examples. Look, we want to get it right, and let's not be disingenuous. 27 properties on the eligible list? No, I don't think there's any serious belief that City Hall that the old town hall, that the First Church or the Bates School, or all but, what? The old St. Mary's Parochial Grammar School, St. James School, and St. Anne's, it's really targeting those 4 properties. I want to underscore the problem of unintended consequences. I want to tell you that the devil, what you already know, and that is that the devil is in the detail, or the divine is in the detail. So there was an initial floating of a proposed ordinance back on July 9th. And here it is 6 months later, almost to the day, 12 days before Christmas. We've got a minimum of the planning board, not a maximum, but we've got the absolute minimum to constitute a quorum present. And we started 45 minutes late. Is that the way to do things? No. Look, for those of you who think you can digest and understand and be totally confident with this ordinance in its current state, which is itself an evolution from the first draft last July, I think, frankly, with respect, you're delusional. Let us not close the public hearing. I can tell you there's no legal requirement under Section 11 or Section 5 of Chapter 48 that we do so. Don't do so. And the custom has always been that we do that. Really up until very, very recently. And that is, again, based on 45 years of experience of dealing as a lawyer and as a preservationist with development in Salem. Let's get it right. Let's continue the public hearing. Let's digest what we hear tonight, because I learned, believe it or not, from the fellow speakers, including Mr. Millar here, about whom I never thought I'd be able to say I've ever agreed. But believe it or not, I have. And let that sink in. Let's return and get it right. Because if you don't get it right, you're going to end up in court. And believe it or not, even though I have a bit of experience in that regard, no one welcomes that. Let's get it right before the fact. One last thing. You know, we have somehow developed the old 1 Broad Street, which was, when I was growing up and Mr. Fury was growing up, that was the administration building that serviced the public schools. What is now the J. Michael Rowan building next door, the old Salem jail. Virtually the Sheridan School in North Salem, the Cogswell School, if Ms. Herbert is still here. It goes on and on. To say that we need to rush to judgment right now because somehow development is not occurring is lunacy. Let's proceed deliberately, carefully. It's getting done already, and let's not rush this thing through. So that, believe it or not, is my succinct form. I urge you to continue the public hearing. Let us all digest this and come back in January and continue moving the ball and curing what are the defects. Thank you very much.
After John, the back wall.
Are you going?
All right.
They said they were and then they didn't.
No problem.
Good evening, board and city council. My name's Gary Gill, Ward 3. Lisa Peterson is my council person. Everything that was said tonight so far that I've heard from this hat, open forum for us to have dialogue, loopholes, and the fact that the church in the Point area and the rectory is not on the list. For the Point area, as much as we have been putting effort into the Point area to rise it up, those two properties there need to be the crown jewel of that neighborhood. And they really should be at the top of the list. Whatever mixed use consumption you can have in there, shops, whatever, it could be good. Retail on the bottom, as Miss Christine says, units up above. The idea of the fact that we don't really know the details, as everybody's saying, the details are in the devil or the devil's details, whatever. I've heard of it many times, I just don't like it. That's what we're scared about more than anything else. Because once the deed is done, the signature's on the paper, the ink's dry, we don't know what's going to happen 10 years from now, 15 years from now. So that's what we really have to think about, long-term effects, and take our time by doing that. But we do need this. Everybody knows we need this. There are some people in here that has young daughters that had to move away from here and go into Boston to try to find cheaper housing. Everybody knows that it's really hard to find housing. And just as the mayor said, get on Craigslist. You're going to have a nightmare. I just saw a unit recently because I'm wanting to move to something where I can afford $1,750. It's an absolutely beautiful property right next door to St. James. There were 6 units in there, 2 bedrooms, 2 baths, 2.5 baths, and then there were 2 units that were 1 bedrooms with 1.5 baths. But the bedroom was so small, your queen bed would fit in there only for $1,750. First month, last month, and a cat security. Where are you going to come up with $4,000 when you don't have it to move into a place like that? So the seniors in the city have it even rougher because there's nobody, you know, even though we have a brand new senior center and Elaine and everybody is really involved in supporting the seniors, and I am as well. But that's who I worry about. And as Mr. Ferry said, you've given a lot to the city. You should be able to stay as long as everybody else can stay too, you know? So I think for us to move forward with this whole discussion is we got to take it a little bit at a time and learn the word mixed use, because that's going to come play in Salem in 2019 for a lot of things. And the dynamics for the city of Salem are changing. You know, we did this to ourselves. It's all good, and the outcome is good and everything, but now we got a big problem. So we're trying to deal with it, and we are trying to deal with it all together. But at the same time, we want it to be nice for our tourism, which is doing very well. And we want to make it comfortable for the people that have been here for a long time and have helped make that the city that it is right now. Because it really was a lot of people saying Salem, 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 hashtag Salem, you know, tweeting everything Salem. Well, now we got it. So now it's on our plates. And I am so happy with everything that I did here tonight from everybody, all of you, all of your input from both sides of the table here. So now it's up to our volunteer planning board and Kim to help guide us in the right direction. But we do, one thing nobody wants to talk about is big commercial business. I know we don't want to become Somerville or Cambridge, but I've been going over there and I've been going into Boston and checking all those places out. They're pretty amazing, you know, and they have made it work because they got old retail stores and they got new storefronts and everything. We went Christmas lighting, driving through a couple towns the other night. Somerville and Cambridge is pretty amazing, you know. And I know that a lot of people are moving to the North Shore because they're starting families. And they want that. They want a little bit of green space. They want a place to park their car. They want a garden. And they want to live a nice, happy life on the North Shore because of our shoreline. Now, that's something else that you need to think about. When Footprint drops that fence along Derby Street, which is, I think, part of the plan, from what I heard way back when, and that waterfront comes available, what are we going to do with that? Are we going to be able to have affordable housing there as well? And also at Shetland property, which is the hot topic. Are we going to be able to give affordable housing to Shetland property? Even though he's older, his family wants to build that, and they will if they get that far. But you have to remember, you can't give all the waterfront to the wealthy. It doesn't work that way anymore. So the buck does stop here, right now in Salem. And I'm so glad that all of you are on the same boat to hear it, discuss it, and move forward with an open mind. But loopholes, the church and the rectory is what I'm asking for. The Point neighborhood needs that. That's the eyesore in the whole community down there, on that corner. It's a dead space, and it has been a dead space. And you don't keep it up. That's the other part. Curb appeal. When you leave a building empty in a town, you leave a town empty. There's no filling there. And besides that, what went on in there and everything and all that, we won't get into, but you need to own up to it too. If you're not going to do anything with the property, you better keep it up clean.
Can you address the chair? If you
That's
have
it.
more?
Thank you. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you. Go ahead. Mike, you go.
Good evening. Mike Becker, 2 School Street Court, Salem. I'm in favor of a reuse ordinance. Without this ordinance, many of the buildings would continue to be unused or underused in a dilapidated state. The R1 and R2 zoning effectively prohibits those sites from being developed. Use variances are not allowed, so these zones and 1 or 2 family respectively would allow for single and 2 family use. No one is ever going to make a 10,000 square foot church into a duplex. The demand for housing is relatively insatiable at the moment. It may not always be that way. However, this ordinance helps to facilitate reuse of existing, potentially blighted buildings rather than fill housing needs with new construction. In a potentially downward turning market, what will be the fate of these historic buildings without this ordinance? I echo some of the sentiments previously made this evening about new construction and have some concerns about dimensional requirements, which mimic the existing B5 downtown zoning, including potentially 0 setback. I don't see why the standard of the underlying zoning can't be the minimum. If it's absolutely necessary for a development due to the existing conditions or hardship to exceed the current zoning setback, the developer, can always apply for a variance. This is a proposal for the present and the future, but we need to be smart about it. I think there are some common sense additions that can be made to this proposal. I think we should put some faith in the professionals on the various boards of our city, planning, design review, historic, and where applicable, Concom and Chapter 91. Any buildings over 75 years old should require historic review and approval. This only makes sense since their mission is to preserve historic buildings. Historic review may add some time to these projects, but it's not a killer. These boards are not unreasonable, and people with obviously good motives, as well as the other boards in the city. If a development is to have a substantial increase in lot coverage by adding a large addition and use up potential on-site parking, then it should not be able to use off-street parking. These are cool little buildings that, as was stated previously, people want to live in. They're currently a drag on our neighborhoods when they could be a tremendous enhancement and a source of tax revenue. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ken Wallace, 172 Federal, Salem. I'm neither for nor against this. I have a deep concern. Unintended consequences, we've heard that used 3 times before. We have a massive illustration of a natural gas company that decided they knew exactly what they were going to do and caused the life of a person, caused houses to burn down, and they've spent $70 million and they're not done by any means. They haven't gone through courts. I haven't heard a word about any engineering assessment of our water grid, our power grid, our septic systems, what they can handle. We're talking 300, 400, 500, 600 more units. If we don't have the information that we need to make the decision at the ground level, at the foundation level, to say what future density is possible to sustain, if we find out that we made a wrong decision on that issue, you're talking millions of dollars to dig up streets, to put in piping, to put in power grids, to put in sewer systems. And I haven't heard a word to say that this is a potential problem or that we have the solution already in hand. And if we don't know the details, we'll make the same mistake that the gas company made by making a plan without having the input from a professional, and the costs could be catastrophic. Thank you.
Yep. On the back wall, anybody? Hold on, free for it. Yep.
So my name's Gracie Cabrera. I live on 31 Simon Street, or Simmons. I've lived there for 3 years, and I'm not really sure how it's pronounced, but with a Y. So this is only my second meeting of this type. This week, I was at one for the Lynn waterfront development. I work in Cambridge, Somerville. I take the commuter rail every day. I also own a vehicle. I think what's going on in Salem is pretty cool. I'm a millennial, so I, when I saw this, I was like, oh, that's exciting. I wonder what they'll do. I went to Federal Street School all the way up to 5th grade. My family lives on the Buffin Street extension area. I see Ice Cream Way, that development. I see...
As you come a little bit closer to the podium, I want to make sure the microphone's picking you up for the
Sorry,
TV.
I'm a little nervous. And on the other side where there's the car lots or whatever. So I see all these things changing and happening, and it's exciting. And, for me, it's like, oh, okay, it's motivating me. This would I could potentially live in or whatever. But it is crazy expensive. And you made some great points about affordability. I think that's critical. My family, when we first came here, lived in the Point. I have family members that couldn't ever afford to live in any of these new developments. So I think that's just something that I wanted to make sure that gets a laser focus. I know they were saying something about having discussions, and that this needs to be part of the conversation. I don't hear anything about like anything immediate. So I think that needs to be a major focus. Like I said, I'm not super prepared to address anything here, but I just thought it was important to get up here and say those things. So it's a little conflicting for me because I have family that needs affordable housing, but I grew up and I'm working in a sector, in an area you see the development all the time, and just in North Salem, I see it all the time walking around. And I'm curious and I check it out. It's just very expensive. So that's all I wanted to say. But.
No, thank you. Next to you first.
Cynthia Nina.
State your name, please.
Yes, Cynthia Nina Soto, 6 Laurent Road. I'm a local realtor, president-elect of the North Shore Association of Realtors, so I echo what Mike Becker has said, what David Friedman has said earlier in, with some other concerns that we have. But I do want to say that I am in favor of this ordinance. I know that it does not solve the housing problem. I know that it doesn't solve, the driving or parking or any of that. The reality is that no one bill, no one proposal is going to resolve that. My grandmother used to say, "Cómo se mueve una montaña, una pieza a la vez." It translates to, how do you move a mountain? One bucket at a time. And we have to take this and take it for what it is. We have buildings that are vacant. They're falling apart. They're not providing any revenue. And we have, as the mayor had said, a waiting list of over 1,000 people waiting for affordable housing. So what are we doing? As a local realtor, I have personally just helped a person, a client of mine, move. She works here in Salem. She's raised her children here in Salem. And she had to move to Lawrence to be able to find affordable housing. And you may think that, well, that's just one person, but that's one single mom with 3 children who will no longer be in this community, who now have to call a new school home, she'll have to find a new job, because how do you make that commute from Lawrence to here and still make ends meet? So I do urge you guys to definitely do consider this. Let's do something to help the affordable housing. We're not going to solve it. And if this creates 10, 20, 30 properties, those are 30 families that we can help. We shouldn't stop here. And if we were to think that we were going to create an ordinance that is going to tackle all of the questions that we have, all of the obstacles, then we would have no need for the planning board. And I think that they're instrumental to this process. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lou Sirianni, Botts Court, Salem. Councilors, Planning Board, Mayor Driscoll, I will be brief. Having practiced architecture for 40 years, I've been required to design and build to conform to zoning requirements in many different cities. In reading this zoning proposal, I see a number of things that I could interpret in different ways. In other words, there are ambiguities as written. I suggest to the council that this ordinance should be reviewed by an attorney well-versed in zoning law. It is not ready for prime time. A few examples. Existing buildings. It should be stated clearly that the existing buildings must be renovated, no parts demolished. This is not clear. Height. It should be that the new construction match the height of the existing building or not higher than 50 feet, whichever is lower. The height of existing buildings should be set at the cornice line, which is usually the gutter line, at the top or at the top of a vertical wall, not the top of the roof. Most would agree that the perception of the height of a building is just that. Setbacks. Setbacks should clearly state that they will match the setbacks of the zone that the building is in. For example, if in a residential zone, it should have the same setback requirements as that zone. Finally, design review board approval should be a requirement, not a recommendation. Please consider giving this ordinance a few more months to get refined. It will serve for many years to come, so let's get it right. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, Ann Whittier, 10 River Street. And I'm not a professional in any of this at all, so I'm just speaking off the cuff as someone who's lived in the town for 47 years. And I just love it. I want to say that I'm all for the preservation of historic entities. But I also feel that Salem itself is a historic entity. And we really need to keep in mind the overall picture of what we really want Salem to be. I sometimes look at the building on Charter Street that was built back when there was this big rush to, ooh, let's get big here. Everyone realized what a mistake it was, and nothing like that was built for the last 40 years, 30 years, something like that. I realize that rents in Salem seem high, let's not forget that wages have not gone up in 10, 15, 20 years either. That's part of the problem. People aren't really making enough. So, okay, affordable housing. Parking is also a real issue. And I was reading about new development in Alston, Brighton, where they suggest that we're building new construction. If you want to come live here, there are no cars allowed. There's no parking. If you want to live here, you don't have a car. A lot of people are filling those places up, and they don't. But you can't build, I think, a lot of new construction and just let people fill it up with cars, because it's a real disconnect. I met people over Haunted Happenings. I met a lovely couple who were in tears because they'd been driving around for hours and could not find a place to park. They were from Maryland. They were ready to leave. The garages were full. Everybody had their signs up, resident parking only, no parking on my street. So why would we want to build invite a lot more people in to come to our street where we don't want anyone to park? So anyway, I just hope that we can talk about this more and try to come up with some more ideas. And also too, with the height, if you build in an R1 or R2 zone and you go up 3 stories, 4 stories, 5 stories, what about the house next door who loses their sunlight, loses their view, loses their air? It's just a whole new environment for them, and I don't think that's fair. So, anyway, thank you.
Carol first.
My name is Carol Carr. I live at 7 River Street, and I've been there for 45 years. Taught at Salem High School for over 28 years, and I recognize Tom there as a fellow teacher. We're both lucky that we can live in Salem right now, and I hope that that continues. I have lots of concerns about the overlay district ordinance, and I also echo the sentiments of previous speakers like Polly and Barbara Sy and my husband. I have lots of concerns about the overlay district ordinance. Preservation is a nice goal. Affordable housing is a nice goal. However, Salem already has above 10% of affordable housing, and nearby communities don't even come close to that. We need to recognize that we cannot be all things to all people. There's got to be a limit. So, by making the process of developing in Salem easier for developers, will we get the results that are good for the neighborhoods? Since developers are driven by profits, will the developer take pains to make their project fit into the neighborhood, or will they build something out of scale and totally unrelated to the neighborhood? And I know I'd gone to one of the Salem Planning Board meetings previously, and somebody was introducing the project about the Ferris development, and I voiced my concern that I really couldn't see how that project was relating to the houses that were across the street. So if you just take it in isolation, oh, okay, maybe it looks okay. But when I see it in relation to the house across the street, you've got this little house here, and then you've got this big development here. So I had suggested maybe if we had some requirement where a developer is required to have a computerized program, and I recommended SketchUp because it's a fairly simple program to learn. But then you can see how people relate to the building that's being suggested and how it relates to things that are already in place. So maybe if someone would take the time to see how a development could happen under this ordinance, using that program, sort of like what Fred did on those pictures, how would it look? Are we giving up too much of our controls, and then the results are not going to happen the way that we expected them to be? So anyways, I think that it's a big change for the city, and we shouldn't rush it. I don't think anybody here has to worry about the developers running away. They're going to come to Salem. Salem's a great city to live in. It's an attractive place. Maybe it's attractive because we have had controls and things have taken their time, but then we've got a really good result, something that we can be proud of. And we say, it took a lot of time, but look at what we have. This is good. So don't close off this discussion. There are some good things in here, but there are lots of tweaking that has to happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Connie Arlander, 91 Federal Street. You'll have to excuse me. It's about the best way I can talk right now. I wanted to go in a different direction. I am in favor of historic preservation, but I wanted to address the topic that Mr. Dibble started with, the green space. New construction will have the dimensions of B5, and it would result in overdevelopment and the possible loss of our green spaces. I have been at a joint planning board meeting and the zoning board where in this room they talked about holding on to green spaces and encouraging developers to add green spaces to their development. And Mr. Dibble brought it up tonight. Greening cities are becoming denser, and it's a major challenge. How do you have this happen in cities? When you overdevelop, adding buildings to an existing property, you lose the possibility of green space. Cities need green spaces that are well designed and creatively delivered. Some issues in Salem are the climate change. It's surrounded by water and it has rivers running through it. The impervious materials that are created by new buildings and the parking areas cause issues, and there's soil erosion as an issue. Benefits of having green spaces is slow stormwater runoff, filter air pollution, improving air quality and making it healthier for residents, reducing erosion of soil in our waterways, reduce physical, social, and economic impacts of storm damage due to flooding, better health benefits, regulating air quality and climate consumption by countering the warming effects of paved surfaces. Urban greening is now recognized as a public health issue. So I wanted people to think about enhancing the green spaces rather than reducing them.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I have a copy for the clerk. Good evening, everyone. I'm Jane Arlander from 93 Federal Street, and I just would like to say how impressed I have been tonight to hear all the citizens that have come out and spoken on this issue. It really is an important issue, and it's quite heartwarming to hear people, to take this much of their time around the holidays and come here and speak to this issue. I think it's pretty amazing that the city of Salem ranks third in the Commonwealth for its number of documented historical resources. When you consider that these documented resources represent a very small fraction of Salem's total number of historic resources, it becomes imperative that this city has the planning and development tools to support the preservation and reuse of its wonderful historic properties. Now, we've had the historic tax credit program in Massachusetts since 2003, and this has been a great incentive for developers to restore and reuse some of Salem's one-of-a-kind buildings. Unfortunately, despite this historic tax credit, local zoning laws can present obstacles to historic preservation. And for this reason, I do support the basic premise of the proposed adaptive reuse overlay district ordinance, which is to restore, preserve, and reuse, whether it be mixed use or affordable housing, the historic buildings that we have. Unfortunately, there are several elements of this overlay district ordinance that make it nothing more than a wolf in sheep's clothing, and therefore I do oppose several parts of this ordinance. First, I do not support the new construction of freestanding buildings on a historic property whereby the new construction will have the dimensional requirements allowed in a B5. I feel that this measure could actually work against historic preservation projects and negatively impact surrounding neighborhoods. I think a good example is the two-phase restoration of the old Salem jail. I think phase one, which was basically the restoration of the superintendent's house and the jail, was magnificent. When they added that next building in phase two, I think you destroyed the streetscape there, the fact that you had open space that was enticing to go look at the little museum inside the jail. It was amazing. And I think that is a very good example of what can go wrong when you have freestanding construction with some of these projects. So I think it's got to be considered. The second thing about this ordinance that I oppose is the fact that there is a set list of properties that has been incorporated into this ordinance. I feel that this list is absolutely discriminatory and arbitrary, and it has been made without the consent of many of the organizations that own these properties. And when I say discriminatory and arbitrary, I'm referring to the fact that every historic church building in the city is on this list, except for St. Joe's. Whereas historic properties like the Plummer Home, Brook House, the Penn buildings, some of the social clubs that are well over 3,000 square feet, they've been excluded. So I don't support any zoning ordinance that arbitrarily selects a subset, just a subset of Salem's historical properties without prior consent of their respective stewards. I just think it's bad karma. So what do I support? I do support a compromise adaptive reuse overlay. And what would this include or allow? It would allow the restoration, preservation, and reuse of abandoned historic municipal and non-municipal buildings. I didn't say anything about church. I said municipal and non-municipal buildings. It allows for the new construction of freestanding buildings that complement the existing historic building that's being preserved and the surrounding neighborhood, and must comply with the dimensional requirements of the existing zoning district. So if it is in a B4, then it will comply with a B4. If it's in an R1, well, maybe they may have to be a variance, but it should comply with the existing zoning district. And finally, this ordinance should allow owners or stewards of abandoned public historic buildings to apply for zoning relief by means of the AROD, or the Adaptive Reuse Overlay District, after meeting certain criteria, rather than being eligible just because they're already included on a predetermined, arbitrary, and discriminatory list of properties. Thank you.
My name's Mary Whitney. I'm at 356 Essex Street. And I too, like I think almost everybody here who spoke, support the adaptive reuse of the historic structures for preservation and to bring them back into active use. Just wanted to say that Salem has almost 400 years of experience with reuse and historic preservation. And I think that we can make a path forward for development to continue this for the city's future. But this overlay district, as proposed, as you've heard, has several shortcomings that I think it's very important to address, and really needs to be redrafted and really needs to be looked at unintended consequences as it's going to become legislation. And I've been at many planning and zoning board meetings, and I think it's great that people are willing to volunteer their time to sit on these boards. But I've also seen where if you, as you've heard, if you open the door, that horse is going to bolt. And I really think this needs, not to delay it, but it needs more work. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further members of the public? Sure.
I didn't sign the paper.
That's fine. We'll sign it when you come up there. That's fine. But then name and address for the record, and then.
My name is Gabriel Ciociola. I'm Vice President of the Salem Common Neighborhood Association, but I'm only speaking here on my own behalf. I want to thank Councilor Fiore for sharing his story. I learned something tonight about hardship people are facing with housing in the city. It's not the first story I've heard recently in this regard. I went to an event at the Salem Athenaeum and I met an elderly gentleman. I won't name names here, but he has cerebral palsy. He was faced with near homelessness for a period of time until he finally got a home in the subsidized housing on Charter Street. My best friend in Salem and his wife live in a very small unit across from the First Church. They're paying over $1,300 a month for a very tiny apartment. Doesn't really have even a proper kitchen to it, and isn't really kept up to the code of habitability by the landlord, and they're afraid that the rent's going to go up even higher and they're going to get priced out of the city. I have another friend at the Salem Athenaeum. She's also a next door neighbor of mine on Winter Street. Her home is a little studio apartment in this multi-unit conversion. It was acquired by a new owner with 24 hours notice. The new owner was taking the place over. 30% increase in her rent from around $900 to something over $300. And I don't have the hobby of going around collecting hardship stories in Salem. This is just stuff that I found out piece by piece recently. So the housing crisis is extremely acute. I hope I'll be corrected if I'm mistaken about this, but I think the main idea behind this ordinance is to create needed housing in a society where too many people are homeless. And the fact that we can get some historic preservation and the salvation of some disused buildings out of it is a very important bonus. But the main objective is to get roofs over the heads of our fellow human beings. I don't like inconvenient parking situations either, but I think that it's more important to find a place for people than it is to find a place for our cars. The objections I've heard tonight are that this proposal isn't green enough, that it isn't strict enough on historic preservation, that it should have more solar panels, or that it needs more parking. I don't think that's the main point of this kind of reform. I hope that the human needs that this ordinance meet take priority. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other persons in the audience at this point? Seeing none, just to clarify the process as we do this in Salem, I have the timetable here, how we do this. From the day that we close the public hearing, whether that is today, whether the will of the body is to close it today or to continue it to a date certain, the planning board does not have a chance to meet and discuss this and incorporate any of these proposed changes or would-be amendments or any of this feedback until they do receive it. So once we close the public hearing and referred it to them, that's why we hold the public hearing jointly, that's the first point at which the planning board can start to incorporate any of these proposed changes, at which, after they do so, after they hear that and report it back to the city council, at that point the city council can then take it and, if they want, put it into committee and amend it further or pass it or whatever, or table it or kill it or whatever that direction might be. So just, I want to make sure that everybody's clear on that part of the process. Once the hearing has been closed, we then have 90 days to vote on it. So if we don't do anything at that point, if we haven't dealt with it at that point, then we would have to have another hearing before we did any further action with it. So that said, I would first, before we make any motions, I would just ask if the mayor could come up for a minute to see if there's anything from this discussion so far. We've had 28 people, I counted.
Can I make a comment, please?
Sure.
I didn't speak yet. I'm sorry, Mayor, but I just had a few comments. One thing is that if we don't make new construction fit existing zoning, historic preservation might be an unintended bait and switch with this zoning, because to rehab some of the old buildings, take out asbestos, lead paint, some of the condition they're in, it may become much cheaper to tear down those buildings and rebuild. And if they can be built higher, a little bit bigger, it'll allow more density, more units, and pay for the project. So if we're looking at historic preservation, not keeping the existing zoning for the neighborhood for new construction may actually work against historic preservation. Another thing I noticed tonight is many of our comments would fit into a meeting about building new public housing, because new public housing would be 100% affordable, not 10%. 10% doesn't do this for us. 10% gives us affordable housing, but the 10% is about a developers making money, which is what developers should be doing. That's what they're in business to be doing. I go to work to make money every day. But 10% doesn't help. Based on the comments made here tonight, I don't think too many people would agree that 10% of these units built would help the situation and help the housing needs that we have. And if we were talking about public housing, that would be 100% affordable, and it would be 100% helping Salem people getting to those units. I mean, we haven't built anything like a Rainbow Terrace, Garden Terrace, Leafwood Terrace for years to help our seniors, to help our needy, to help our veterans. We haven't done that, and we really need to find a way to do that. Things like that should be being improved every 5 years or so, almost like part of a 5-year plan, not a 50-year plan. I mean, I was a boy living in Rainbow Terrace when my dad was a veteran. It was all World War II veterans back then, and it moved people up and out. Very few people stayed in there a long amount of time. They got on their feet, they got into an apartment, and for us, we bought a 2-family and then moved on from there. So, and then somebody else moved in and into the, the city, the state housing, Salem Redevelopment Authority. That's the kind of thing I think we really need to be looking forward to, for the big plan. Even things like Fairweather Apartments, which are privately owned on Highland Avenue across from the middle school, over 55 housing and all income based. So in essence, all housing for needy people, not 10%. If we go and build a lot of new units in Salem, and we can't say to a developer, you have to allow just Salem people move in. We couldn't at St. Joe's, we couldn't at people at Highlands when I was in high school. We can't do that. We're not against newcomers moving to town by any circumstance. But if we build new units and half or most of the people, because as was said tonight, Salem's a place people want to move to. People from Somerville and places like that where it's more expensive are going to want to move here. So if we build these new units and most of the people move in aren't from Salem, we didn't help our needy, we didn't help our veterans, we didn't help our seniors, and all we end up hurting is our infrastructure, our parking, our traffic, and can our, as was said tonight, and I agree, can our water and sewer handle this? How do we know? And lastly, we're a city of 43,000 people, but nobody seems to realize that we have 10,000 more people 9 months a year. We have Salem State University here. 9 months a year, we're a city of 53,000 people. And how many more people can we take? Can we take 5,000, 10,000, 20,000? I don't know the answer, but somebody needs to get that answer out here. We can only help so many. We're not able to help or to accommodate every person that wants to move to Salem. I strongly believe that our housing needs need to be driven by what Salem people and Salem families need, not by what the state needs Salem to do for them. And with that, I'll yield.
Thank you. So, Mayor, if you, I just had a couple of things I wanted to follow up on, if I could.
Just a couple
And there
of
might
quick-
be a couple follow-up questions from councilors, so, or planning board members for you on this. So, the biggest concern that I take away is that concern about new construction and making sure that there are no loopholes to it and that there are no opportunities for construction. And I get the restriction on the amount of site coverage, but I would also echo a bit of the at-large councilor's point that if there could be an unintended consequence that if a prospective redeveloper deemed that, got consent that the building was too damaged or too difficult to remediate, then perhaps they would propose taking it down and replacing it with new construction that would be larger than would otherwise be permitted there. So that's a bit of. And again, as I said at the beginning, not being the zoning expert, I would want to make sure that that scenario is not something that's possible by it. I see a man up ready with a response on that too, so I'm assuming so.
I just want to note that, again, the criteria is you have to reuse the existing building. So demolition of the building is not allowed under the special permit. So you wouldn't be able to have that bait and switch. The existing building has to be reused and repurposed. And if it doesn't exceed the 50% lot coverage, then you could have a new addition.
You can only have the new addition if you're meeting the parking and access, and so just want to make
the lot
that
coverage factoring in.
really
Right.
clear. Right. So let me just say a couple of points, because I know it's late and we want to get the heck out of here. One, I heard a lot of good information today. I actually have not taken the lead on this design of this ordinance. Tom Daniel has. He held the 2 public meetings. I mean, there was a lot of input that led to what we have, and changes were made from the initial filing. And I think there's some changes and adjustments, modifications that could be made based on some of the comments that we heard this evening, working with the planning board to try and achieve that. I do think there's a couple of clarification points that are really, really important, because I feel like people, it's not clear based on some of the comments that we heard. The list, right? The list is not incorporated into the ordinance. The list was generated because we got requests from counselors and others to say, well, how many properties would be eligible? There's an eligibility requirement, and if you meet that requirement, we tried to incorporate you into a list that we provided to the council as an example. It was not meant to be exhaustive. It is certainly not discriminatory. It was an attempt to showcase, well, based on the criteria in the ordinance, these are some of the properties that might qualify at some time in the future or at present. If there's an easier way just to get at the properties that we know there's interest in right now, believe me, we try and do it. But spot zoning or use variances were the only 2 options that we came up with. And that's how this ordinance was designed. Let's put in place some basic qualifications, religious, municipal buildings, took out parks to try and limit that further.
And we know those several properties on there that I don't expect will ever, I don't think we'll see housing in City Hall, right? I can't predict the future, 50 years from now.
This might make a great living room for us.
It would be great housing if it was housing, but there's clearly a lot of buildings on there. MSBA, occupied schools, like there's no intention and there's a strong likelihood those would not occur. But they do meet that minimum threshold of square footage and religious or municipal use. So it's not to encourage them, it's just the list was prepared to highlight the examples that people asked us to provide to give an idea of what the eligibility requirements are.
I understand the alternative that would be discriminatory at that point.
That's correct. The unintended consequences, I've heard that a lot. Look, nobody wants unintended consequences. We all want these buildings preserved, opportunities for housing, particularly affordable if we can maximize that. But zoning isn't a perfect tool, and we do need to have some flexibility. And we do have a huge backstop, in my mind, and that's the planning board. We could pull out our existing zoning that we have, and we could create a scenario using it that we end up with something we don't like. That's why we have a group of people who discern the information, review it. I heard a lot of comments around, we don't know anything about infrastructure, and what about the water and the sewer and the drainage and electricity? If you spend any time at site plan review, those are the very exact issues they're looking at. And not just relying on what a developer might be telling us, but also having all of those items peer reviewed with independent engineers that we hire, that they pay for, their dollars, but that work for us to review those systems, to make sure it's adequate, to leverage improvements. And many, if not most of our decisions require developers to make improvements to those areas. The new water line I just mentioned on Flintan, they didn't want to do that. That's a requirement. It was necessary based on the review. So we try and cover those bases and address them with people who are reasonable, reviewing the circumstances before them. It's a completely public process. We hear from abutters all the time and others who are concerned or interested or want to talk about a project so we can make sure those impacts are addressed. It's a really solid process. I will say again, what's the project that's the disaster that the planning board approved in 20, 30 years? Which one? I don't know that I think there is one. There might be ones that I'd like a little different color or a little different approach, but there's no disaster project. Even the Salem jail that we talked about, which was supported by Historic Salem, worked hard to get done, it didn't happen unless there was that new construction with it. And I don't particularly love them either, whoever mentioned that, right? Thank you, Jane. I don't love driving by and seeing those, but you wouldn't have had the jail without it. And sometimes there are these trade-offs that need to happen, and part of that is zoning. So I want to call it one last thing, and that is just the time. We heard a lot of information. A lot of it was very consistent around new construction and how do we address unintended consequences. I think we'll try and better understand the ways that we can do that and adjust it. But I want to make one just call for, we submitted this in October. The process actually started back in June. We couldn't actually get a hearing date that everybody's schedule could accommodate, and we almost didn't get it tonight. Thank you, Matt, for bailing us out.
Thanks, Matt.
Because these guys are out 2 nights a week on volunteer activities. You guys are busy. I know what people have asked to keep the public hearing open. I actually think we can we could close the public hearing and work with the planning board to meet and adjust the things we heard about, and hopefully bring it back to this council. There is ample opportunity for public comment on anything that's on the agenda. I worry about the timeline. It'll be another month to a month and a half before we're able to find a date that will allow for the public hearing to be continued. Then you're going to close it. Then the planning board, that's when the real, a lot of the real work begins with the planning board going through these issues so we can report something back to you that hopefully reflects some of the concerns that were raised here and addresses them so we can move forward with hopefully a positive project. We don't want to have circumstances where people aren't supportive of ordinances. If there's a way to moderate that, I want to try and do that. I also know that we need to have some trust in a site plan review process, and we're probably not going to be able to mitigate every single potential if somebody stacks something on top of, you're going to have to rely on the common sense and review strengths of planning boards, both past, present, and future. And since the time I've been here, I think we've had some pretty solid boards led by people who are qualified with full-time staff to address it, and a pretty active and engaged community who comes out to let us know when they don't like things and sometimes when they do. So I guess I just want to put out there the timeline and the concern about keeping that open. And I'll ask the board members, I don't know I know how busy everybody is, if there's any, I'm just worried about if this will be, we won't be done until April, by the time we get schedules and get things done. I don't mean done, I mean done in terms of something even back to you. And now we've practically lost a building season in 2019, and it's a real issue. And so it's not trying to rush it and not hearing what people are saying. It's trying to get to the hard work of working with the planning board to try and make some adjustments. So, thank you.
Any other members of the City Council have any comments or planning board? Councilor Dominguez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that we need to thank everybody who speak out very loud and clear. This is a reflection of who we are here in Salem, and I'm very happy to be involved in this type of hearing. And I hear from the comments, the majority of people wanted to keep it open. I understand what the mayor say. I know we have to be very time sensitive in a matter that is very important to the city of Salem. But I think that we hear the public. If I go to my note, most of the people, maybe 90% of the people who stand up, they say they wanted to keep it open because they need to hear more about it. And I think that we need to continue to discuss the matter in a way that we can feed and we can clarify many of the issues that we hear tonight here in this public hearing. So I don't know the process basically on how we keep it open, but I'm in favor to keep it open for more discussion.
All right, I would say just before I recognize Councilor Dibble, who also had his hand up, we don't get any changes and the feedback doesn't get incorporated into this because right now it's in the hearing status. That doesn't get incorporated until the planning board has received it, and they don't receive it until we close the public hearing.
I understand.
Right, if we extend the public hearing, it's really, should we choose to do so, and that's up to the will of the council and the planning board, should we choose to do so, really the only thing that happens is we come back here and hear from people again, but without any substantive changes at that point. We don't get the changes until we close it and send it to the planning board. So that's just for your consideration. Councilor Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What you just said is true, but we could also get changes to this before we close the public hearing and have the mayor take a look at this and maybe address with her or with her administration, address some of the concerns that pretty much everybody in this room was agreeing upon some of them. I think everybody in the room agreed that these properties should be preserved. The historic buildings should be preserved. That we need more housing in Salem, and that we need more affordable, low-income and senior housing. That's a given. What we don't need is the big loopholes in, I think the mayor said it again, the unintended consequences with this. I think somebody said it was Fred that drew these up that were submitted. If anybody wants to see these, take a look. But you have 3 examples of new construction. One in the parking lot of the Immaculate Conception Church, a pretty large building that might hold 100 units if I were to count them. One behind the St. James School, and a third large 6-story building behind St. James Church in their parking lot. Those 3 are all brand new constructions, and I don't think that's the intended consequence of this ordinance, but it might be a reality. I think they're all going to be legal based upon the B5 zoning.
Say, unless I'm entirely incorrect, that would be excluded by the 50% lot coverage by all buildings with new construction that's in here.
I think it would meet
substantially larger than 50%.
Mr. Chair, I think it would meet the ordinance as written. So we need to be careful. It's now a reality on paper. We want to make sure it doesn't become a reality. So I strongly, oh, by the way, I'd like to say at our last joint public hearing on another zoning matter a few months ago, we closed it after one meeting. Planning board went forward and do their things. And the night after we closed it, I wrote up a couple of additional concerns that I thought about after that meeting, that one night meeting was closed. And I fired off a letter to the planning board, asked for it to be distributed with some ideas. Our city planner would not allow that, my ideas, my additional comments, because the public hearing was already closed. So having that hearing in one night was just, for me personally, was not sufficient enough time
to digest all the comments, all the letters, everything else. Some of these letters I haven't even I haven't read yet. They were just handed to me or emailed me tonight. So we should digest this and get it right. So I really want to see this left open, especially after the last example, and I'm fairly new on this council, I've been here 3 years now, but for my notes from one meeting to not be shared with the planning board, that's just wrong. Years ago, and I worked for the city of Salem for 14 years in City Hall in the 80s and 90s, and we kept public hearings open and really worked to get it right instead of rushing something through. I wholeheartedly agree with the mayor that this is taking a long time. The first meeting was 2 seasons ago. It was a long time ago that I went and listened to Tom Daniel speak in June, I think it was. But now we're in the middle of the holiday season. We should, and I apologize, Mayor, I think we should keep this open, that we should ask you to make some revisions to this ordinance, get it back to the city council, we reconvene, and we try to get it right. Try to get it right the first time so we have a good product that we can keep these buildings, get them restored immediately, get more housing in Salem, preferably more affordable housing. And again, Mr. Chair, I think we need to do it and do it right. So I'd like to move that we continue the public hearing.
Date certain.
To a date certain, thank you.
You have to come up.
Before anything else, Councilor Milo had a question or comment?
Yeah, if I may, and maybe the clerk can correct me, but I think I'm looking at your notes here, or somebody's notes that talk about timeframes, and it looks like if we were to close the hearing tonight, we would have to hear back from the planning board by January 3rd? Is that right?
No.
What's the 21 days? I'm looking at this right here.
It's 90 days from the closing of the public hearing.
90.
21
Their
days
recommendation.
after hearing for planning board to report back to council?
Their plan, their recommendation. Planning board recommendation is 21 days.
Yeah. So to hear back from the planning board, it would have to be 21 days after we close the hearing, right?
That's the timeline.
So,
That's
so that's what I'm
not-
saying. So if we close it tonight, we have to get your comments back by January 3rd?
That's not 21 days. From tonight.
Right? Is that, am I getting this right?
It's 21 days.
21 days, so let's, and I think it's, I
To
think
get
it's
the
January 3rd.
comments
Somebody-
back.
What's that?
To get the recommendation
To get
back.
the recommendations
But the vote
back,
doesn't
right.
have to happen
So-
until 90 days.
No, I understand that, but in other words, we received them January 3rd. But we haven't even reorganized on January 3rd, right? We don't do that till the 7th, right? So I guess, in terms of dates and looking for comments back to have a discussion, as a council,
They would be hearing it they would be adding it to their agenda for their next meeting, for their meeting next week to review, and then, assuming they completed it, they would send their recommendations on it
Yeah.
back to us,
Right.
and then
It
that
just-
would go on to our first agenda
It just has to
of
be
the new year.
time-stamped in within 21
It'd be
days.
submitted
We
to
don't
us.
have to meet before, like, at that 21 days.
Yeah,
It just
submit
has to
the
be
communication.
received by 21 days, and then it'd be taken up you can take it up at our next council meeting in January.
they just have to get it back to us within 21 days.
Correct.
You have 90 days to act.
And then we have 90 days from
Yes.
that, from the close of the hearing to vote.
Now, let me ask one question of the clerk. Would they be able, if they weren't able to complete it on, let's say they weren't able to complete their deliberations on the 18th, would they be able to continue it to their next regular planning meeting and extend the deadline out that way, or do they have to complete it that day?
With council can act, I only know that the 21 days, the planning board, if they don't report within the 21 days, the council can act.
Okay, so we would be able to act independently at that point should they not complete it and get it back submitted and time-stamped. Then the council could choose to act on its own if we wanted to. At that point, it becomes the council's discretion, basically, as to whether to wait on it or to act. Okay, thank you for the clarification. Councilor Peterson, did you have?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to say, I think it's important for us to move forward as efficiently and quickly as possible, but I am concerned about the time of year right now. I think since we saw so many enthusiastic speakers tonight, I'm assuming
28 to be exact.
I'm assuming that that this is just probably a subset, since we're in sort of the holiday season and a lot of people are probably busy right now. We did get a lot of letters, which is fills that out somewhat, but I'm concerned about turning this around over the holidays. I think I would be in favor of extending it, but only not for a very long
Well, should
period
we
of time. Maybe
choose
just
to keep it
into
open?
January.
It has to be to a date
Yeah.
certain.
Yeah, but I would
So-
be in favor of doing that, but only into like early in the new year.
Yeah, and we would have to have it after our reorganization.
Right.
So those are the only caveats to it. So, with that, is that Councilor Dibble?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. I made a motion to continue the public hearing. The good Ward 1 councilor reminded me that we need a date certain, so I'd like to throw out a possibility of January 17th, Thursday. It should be free for the planning board because they're not meeting that night, and for ourselves. And this might give the mayor and her administration a chance to fine-tune this ordinance that is needed. And I want to support this, but as it's written right now, I don't think we have enough support on the council to pass this with the 8 required votes. And I think we want to make some tweaking on this so it's protected, and we get this thing right and we get it passed.
Is the 17th scheduled planning board meeting date? Yes. So that would conflict with their regular scheduled meetings.
Perhaps the planning board would like to throw out a suggested date. Maybe the 9th, January 9th, so we're not waiting so long and pushing it back as the Ward 3 councilor suggested.
Is that?
As a Wednesday?
Then Wednesday the 9th.
January 9th?
I don't see it in the city at the moment. but-
Agenda day, that Tuesday, Wednesday, the public hearing, then our council meeting is that Thursday. And we have a reorg meeting on Monday.
I think I started my president year with a reorg meeting, with one of these after the reorg meeting, so if we need to do that, then we do that, so. I leave it up to the body to come up with a date. Councilor Dominguez?
I second.
Yeah, no, I acknowledge that. We're just trying to work out a date right now to decide what the date certain of said motion would be.
Yeah.
So I'll let the body deliberate amongst themselves. Do we have a date that works for everybody, if that's the case?
What about the 16th, a week later? 16th? No.
So it's January 9th works for the planning board?
Wednesday, they meet on a Thursday. What about
Okay,
this?
and
The 6th?
does that work for the council generally?
What day? Steve, what day?
All right, so we have a motion
Wednesday
to
the 9th?
continue to a date certain of January 9th, and I would, at 6 p.m. I'd say 6:30 p.m. to make sure that people actually get here.
7 o'clock.
That's good, fair point, because
We saw it tonight.
yeah, we saw tonight that starting at 6:30 might not be so easy sometimes for that, so.
Can I reframe my motion if I?
Absolutely, Councilor.
I'd like to make a motion that we continue the public hearing to a date certain on Wednesday, January 9th at 7 o'clock p.m.
All right, Councilor Dibble is moved, and it was seconded by Councilor Dibble moves that the hearing be continued to a date certain of January 9th, 2019 at 7 p.m., seconded by Councilor Dominguez.
Can I make a comment before we
Yes.
vote? I just wanted to make a comment on some Councilor Dibble said and things that have been said about unintended consequences and people's worry and anxiety about zoning changes similar to this, with a little historical, comparison. It's, everybody knows what a planned urban development is, the PUD, and the first one having been Picker and Wharf. And I think everybody in the room would agree that Picker and Wharf is a pretty nice place to go to. Well, sometime later, I think most people would agree that the Stop and Shop on Howley Street is not as beautiful as Picker and Wharf, right? Well, that was another planned urban development. So the planned urban development that made Picker and Wharf possible was also used to build a Stop and Shop on Howley Street. When it wasn't going a certain way with zoning, a one-family house was bought to combine with the property and made it a planned urban development because it had housing and commercial aspect. So that has always stuck in my mind as something that wasn't quite what the planned urban development was meant to be for. So there's people in this room that worry that something's going to happen near them, around them, or that wasn't quite the intended, what we're intended to do with this zoning. So that's if it helps people understand some anxiety, that's a little bit of history on something that didn't quite go with everything that happened with the PUD.
Councilor Gary, and then...
Just a point of information to clarify, Councilor Sargent. My father worked at that place where that was before. It was burned down, all the factory. Burned down. I think Stop and Shop is much more positive to the neighborhood, to the city of Salem.
That wasn't my point.
Burned out.
My point was...
Gentlemen, we have a motion on the floor.
My point,
Please,
Stop and Shop works fine. My point is it's not a planned urban development.
Councilor, so we have the motion on the floor, as I said, I indulged this for a minute, but we have a motion, that's an interesting time, whatever that is. We have a motion to continue it to a date certain of January 9th at 7 p.m., seconded by Councilor Dibble, seconded by Councilor Dominguez. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor? Opposed? So moved. Councilor Fury?
Motion to adjourn.
Councilor Fury moves to adjourn. We are adjourned.